The morning sun spilled golden rays across the busy streets of Atlanta, painting long shadows that stretched over the pavement like silent witnesses to the city's restless heartbeat. It was a place where towering glass skyscrapers gleamed against the sky, their modernity clashing with the weathered brick and history-soaked sidewalks below. For Captain Leah Foster, this tension between yesterday and today wasn't just scenery, it was the rhythm of her existence. At 42, she carried herself with a quiet strength, the kind forged through years of pushing against a world that often tried to box her in. As the head of a specialized FBI task force, her mission went beyond enforcing the law. It was about dismantling the unseen walls that still silenced voices and erased lives. With her deep brown skin, proud natural curls framing her face, and eyes that cut through pretense like a blade, Leah wasn't just a presence, she was a force. Yet beneath her steady calm churned a storm she'd spent a lifetime learning to tame. That day had started like any other, wrapped in the deceptive simplicity of routine. She'd sat at her kitchen table, the aroma of fresh coffee curling around her as she scrolled through case files on her tablet. The soft clatter of dishes in the sink mingled with the muffled sound of her teenage son, Malcolm, racing through the house. At 15, he was a whirlwind of energy and sharp wit, his backpack slung over one shoulder as he shouted a hurried, "Bye, Mom," before darting out the door to catch the school bus. Leah's lips curved into a faint smile, but her chest tightened. Malcolm was her tether, the living, breathing reason she kept fighting. She saw so much of herself in him, his curiosity, his quiet determination, but she couldn't shake the gnawing fear of the world he was growing into, a world she knew too well. Raised on Atlanta's south side in a modest home filled with love and hard-earned wisdom, Leah had seen the jagged edges of justice up close. Her father, a retired teacher with a voice that carried the weight of patience, and her mother, a nurse whose hands healed more than just bodies, had planted a seed in her. Education and grit could shatter even the thickest barriers of prejudice. That belief had carried her through law school, into the FBI, and up the ranks, each step a defiance of the quiet doubts whispered behind her back. She'd become the first black woman to lead her division, a title that gleamed with pride, but pressed down on her shoulders like a yoke. In public, she was unflinching, her authority a shield. But alone, in the stillness of her own mind, the cracks showed a bone-deep exhaustion, a frustration she swallowed down and turned into fuel. That morning, though, she'd pushed those feelings aside. The day ahead loomed heavy with meetings and casework, and she needed a moment to breathe. A quick stop at a small convenience store near her office seemed harmless enough, a chance to grab a bottle of water and a snack to carry her through the long hours. She stepped out of her car, the late summer air thick with humidity, and strode toward the store with the same confidence that had earned her respect. In every corner of her career, her tailored blazer hugged her frame, her heels clicking against the pavement with purpose. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting a sterile glow over the narrow aisles. She moved with quiet intent, her fingers brushing over a chilled water bottle before settling on a granola bar. It was a simple act, one she'd done 1,000 times, but she couldn't have known that her very existence was about to ignite a firestorm of venom in someone else's heart. As she approached the counter, the air shifted. A uniformed officer lingered near the coffee machine, his broad frame slouched casually against the wall, his fingers curled around a styrofoam cup, steam rising in faint wisps. But his eyes locked onto her with a cold intensity that made her skin prickle. There was no reason for it. She hadn't so much as glanced his way, but his gaze narrowed, his jaw tightening as if her presence alone offended him. She set her items on the counter, her movements deliberate, but he stepped forward, planting himself between her and the cashier like a wall of misplaced authority. "Hold on," he barked, his voice dripping with a mix of command and contempt. "What do you think you're doing here?" Leah's pulse quickened, but she kept her composure, her response smooth and firm. "Just making a purchase, same as everyone else." Her words hung in the air, steady as stone. But his eyes raked over her head to toe, invasive and sharp. A sneer twisted his lips, his head tilting as if he were sizing up a threat. "Funny," he drawled, his tone laced with mockery. "You don't look like you belong in a place like this. What are you really up to?" The accusation landed like a slap, absurd and baseless. But it carried the weight of something darker, something she'd felt before, though never so brazenly. The store grew quieter, the hum of conversation fading as other customers turned to watch. Their whispers buzzed like static curiosity tinged with discomfort, but no one stepped forward. Leia's fingers tightened around her wallet as she pulled it from her purse, her voice unwavering despite the heat rising in her chest. "If you'll excuse me, I don't intend to stand here justifying myself to you." She moved to slide her card toward the cashier, a young woman with wide eyes who looked frozen in place. But the officer wasn't finished. He leaned closer, his breath sour with coffee and spite, his voice dropping to a menacing hiss. "That's where you're wrong. People like you always think you can strut around, acting like you own everything. Not here. Not on my watch." The words sliced through her, sharp and humiliating, a blade aimed at her dignity. She drew a slow, deliberate breath, her mind racing to stay calm as the weight of his hostility and the staring eyes around her pressed down like a vice. She tried again, her tone steady but edged with steel. "I don't know what you think I've done, but this is harassment, plain and simple." The word felt too small for what was unfolding, a mere shadow of the outrage building inside her. But before she could finish, his posture shifted, shoulders squaring, hand darting out. His fingers clamped around her arm with a bruising force that made her flinch, yanking her away from the counter as her water bottle and granola bar tumbled to the floor. With a dull thud, the room went still, save for her sharp gasp and the clatter of her fallen items. "Let go of me," she demanded, her voice rising, cutting through the silence like a whip. But he ignored her, dragging her toward the door, his grip tightening as if she were a criminal caught red-handed. "Suspicious behavior," he muttered, loud enough for the onlookers to hear. "Gotta make an example out of troublemakers like you." Her heels scraped against the linoleum, her heart pounding as she tried to twist free. "You have no right," she began, her protest fierce but unfinished. He spun to face her, his eyes blazing with a fury that seemed to feed on her defiance. "I have every right," he spat, his voice trembling with unchecked power. "I decide who walks free and who doesn't. You think you're better than me? That you can talk back to an officer? Let me show you how wrong you are." What happened next stole the breath from the room. His hand shot to her neck, fingers digging into her skin as he shoved her against the wall near the entrance. Her head snapped back, pain blooming sharp and sudden, her vision swimming for a heartbeat. She clawed at his wrist, her breath trapped in her throat, disbelief crashing over her like a wave. The sheer audacity of his raw, unmasked abuse left her reeling. And then came his words, low and vicious, each one a dagger meant to bury her. "You're nobody. Just another nobody pretending to be someone." The humiliation was a suffocating fog, the injustice a stone lodged in her chest. She couldn't fight back, not here, not like this, but her spirit refused to break. When he finally released her with a rough shove, she stumbled but caught herself, trembling yet unbowed. The store remained deathly silent, a gallery of stunned faces too afraid or too uncertain to act. The officer turned away, his swagger dripping with arrogance, muttering to himself, "Another troublemaker dealt with." He didn't look back as he strode out, leaving behind a shattered moment and a woman whose mind was already alight with resolve. She stood there, her breath uneven, her hands clenched at her sides, a single thought burning through the haze. "He doesn't know who I am, but he will." This wasn't just about her. It was about every soul who'd been diminished, disrespected, dehumanized by men like him and who wielded power like a club, blind to the consequences. What he couldn't have guessed, what no one in that store could have imagined, was that Leah Foster wasn't just a woman buying water. She was a reckoning in waiting, her badge and authority tucked out of sight but no less real. The cashier, still pale and shaken, stepped forward hesitantly, offering a quiet, "Are you okay?" Leah nodded, her jaw tight, already plotting her next move. The officer's smug exit was the last he'd see of her as a nobody. Soon, he'd face the truth and the fallout would be seismic. Justice, she knew, wasn't just a word, it was a promise. And when it came, it would strike with a force he'd never see coming. A lesson in the ruin that follows when power turns tyrant. The story was far from over, and Leah was already writing its next chapter in her mind. one where the scales tipped hard and true. The air in the convenience store was heavy, thick with the kind of stillness that precedes a tempest. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a cold, sterile glow across the chipped linoleum floor and the cluttered shelves stocked with candy bars, cheap sodas, and packs of cigarettes. Layla stood near the counter, her posture straight but not rigid, a quiet strength radiating from her as she placed a bottle of water and a granola bar down. With careful precision, her fingers lingered on the items for a split second longer than necessary, as if grounding herself in the mundane act of shopping amidst the storm she could sense brewing. She was no stranger to this feeling, weight of eyes on her, the unspoken judgments that clung to her like shadows. She'd spent years steeling herself against it, her resolve forged in the fires of too many lives she'd seen crushed by prejudice, and too many futures snuffed out by systems that bent under their own flaws. That morning, her mind was a whirlwind of focus and fatigue, her packed agenda looming over her like a dark cloud. She was spearheading an investigation into a corruption scandal that snaked its way through the upper echelons of Atlanta city officials, a case that demanded every ounce of her meticulous nature. One misstep, she knew, and the vultures circling her would swoop in, eager to tear apart her credibility and unravel the work she'd poured her soul into. Her colleagues admired her for her diligence, her ability to navigate the political minefield of their world with a steady hand. But Layla wasn't naive. She felt the difference between their respect and true acceptance, a chasm she could never quite bridge. In the quiet moments, she heard the whispers that trailed her through the office, murmurs from those who doubted her authority, their voices laced with envy or disdain. Some saw her success as an affront, a disruption to the order they clung to. She carried that awareness with her now, a silent burden that sharpened her senses as she stood in the store, the hum of the refrigerator behind her blending with the faint static of a radio playing somewhere in the back. Across the room, Officer Ethan Caldwell leaned against a display of potato chips, his broad shoulders squared and his uniform crisp despite the early hour. At 38, he'd spent more than a decade carving out his place in the Atlanta Police Department, building a reputation as a man who didn't flinch, who got results. To his superiors, he was a model officer, now decisive, with arrest numbers that made them nod approvingly over their morning coffee. But beneath the polished badge and the stern set of his jaw, Ethan was a man unraveling, his life a tangle of control and the desperate need to hold onto it. He sipped his black coffee, the bitter taste mirroring the resentment that simmered in his chest. This quiet assignment stationed at a convenience store on the edge of downtown felt like a punishment, a waste of his talents. He craved the rush of a chase, the crackle of his radio as he barked orders, the moments when he could flex his authority and feel the world bend beneath it. Standing here, watching the cashier count change for a sleepy customer, made his skin itch with frustration. Ethan's worldview had been molded long ago, in the cramped living room of a working-class home just beyond the city limits. His father, a retired police sergeant with a gravelly voice and a permanent scowl, had filled his childhood with stories of a golden era, an imagined time when cops ruled the streets, without hesitation, unburdened by oversight or apologies. Those lessons had sunk deep into Ethan's bones, hardening into a brittle shell of distrust and superiority. He saw himself as a guardian, a bulwark against a society he believed was crumbling. Over the years, that belief had twisted into something uglier, a conviction that certain people who didn't fit his narrow vision had no right to the spaces he patrolled. He justified it with half-remembered platitudes from his father and a stubborn refusal to look inward, his anger a shield against any flicker of doubt. That morning, as the sun crept higher and painted the store's grimy windows with streaks of gold, Ethan's restlessness sharpened into something predatory. His eyes scanned the room, searching for a target to pin his irritation on. And then Layla walked in. She moved with purpose, her dark coat brushing her knees, her expression focused yet distant, as if her mind were still tangled in the threads of her investigation. She didn't notice him at first, her attention fixed on the counter ahead. But Ethan's gaze latched onto her instantly. His pulse quickened, a familiar surge of adrenaline flooding his veins. To him, she was an anomaly, a woman who carried herself with too much confidence, Who didn't shrink or soften under the weight of his stare? His mind raced, spinning a story from nothing. She didn't belong here, not in his territory. The assumptions came fast and unbidden, rooted in a lifetime of biases he'd never questioned. The tension in the store thickened, a silent current crackling between them. Layla reached the counter, setting her items down with a soft clink, her movements deliberate, almost defiant in their calmness. She felt Ethan's scrutiny like a blade pressed against her spine, but she didn't turn, didn't give him the satisfaction of a reaction. She'd learned that lesson years ago. Any crack in her composure, any hint of fear, could be seized upon, twisted into a weapon. Behind the counter, the cashier, a weary young man with tired eyes and a faded name tag that read Jamal, kept his head down, his fingers fumbling as he scanned her items. He sensed the brewing conflict, his shoulders hunching as if he could make himself invisible. Jamal had seen officers like Ethan before, men who wore their badges like crowns, and he'd learned to keep quiet, to avoid the fallout. But his nervousness betrayed him, his hands trembling slightly as he punched numbers into the register. Ethan broke the silence first, his voice slicing through the hum of the store like a gunshot. "You look nervous. Got something to hide?" His tone was casual, almost lazy, but it carried an edge, a challenge wrapped in accusation. He straightened from his slouch, his boots scuffing the floor as he took a step closer, his coffee cup still clutched in one hand. Layla didn't flinch. She kept her back to him, her voice steady as steel when she replied, "Just buying a bottle of water and a granola bar." "Is that a problem?" Her words were measured, each one chosen with care. The weight of someone who'd faced this kind of confrontation too many times to count. She wasn't rattled, not yet, but inside, her mind churned. She knew where this could lead, how quickly a mundane moment could spiral into something dangerous. When power was wielded without restraint, Ethan's lips twitched, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth as he closed the distance between them. "Depends," he drawled, his voice dripping with condescension. "Some people come in here looking like they don't belong. Makes you wonder what they're really up to." He tilted his head, studying her like a hunter sizing up prey, his confidence bolstered by the badge glinting on his chest. Layla turned her head just enough to meet his gaze over her shoulder, her eyes locking onto his with a quiet, unyielding defiance. Her face remained composed, but beneath it, a flicker of anger stirred, danger at the familiarity of this dance, at the exhaustion of having to justify her existence. "And what exactly does belong look like to you?" she asked, her voice low but piercing, the question hanging in the air like a dare. Ethan's jaw tightened, a muscle ticking beneath his skin. Her response threw him off. Balancha was used to people shrinking, stammering, offering excuses. Her refusal to bend only fueled the fire in his chest. His hand twitched at his side, itching to rest on the radio clipped to his belt, a silent threat he didn't need to voice. Ma'am," Jamal interjected, his voice shaky as he glanced between them. "Your total's $3.75. He wanted this over, wanted them both out of his store before the air grew any heavier. Layla reached into her bag, her movements slow and deliberate, pulling out a crisp $5 bill. She could feel Ethan's suspicion swelling, his eyes boring into her as if he could will her to crack. To him, every gesture she made was evidence, feeding a narrative he'd already written in his head. He stepped closer, his shadow falling across the counter. "You know," he said, his voice dropping to a menacing murmur, "I've seen it all in this neighborhood. People thinking they can stroll in, act like they own the place, and then bam, they're caught red-handed. Makes you think twice about who you trust." Layla exhaled slowly, her patience fraying like a thread pulled too tight. She turned fully to face him now, her stance unwavering, the tension between them sparking like a frayed wire. "I don't know what you think you've seen," she said, her tone sharp and deliberate, "but I suggest you keep your assumptions to yourself. I'm not here to play whatever game you're trying to start." Ethan's smirk faltered, just for a heartbeat, before he leaned into it, doubling down. "Game?" he scoffed, his voice rising slightly. "You think this is a game? Let me tell you something. People like you think they can just walk in here and do whatever they want. Not on my watch." The words landed like a blow, heavy and deliberate, meant to assert a dominance he felt slipping. Layla's fists clenched at her sides, her nails biting into her palms as she fought the urge to fire back. She knew this script to wealth way a single spark could ignite into something uncontrollable. How her restraint was her only shield against the violence he might justify. With a flick of his wrist, instead, she let the silence stretch, her gaze boring into him with an intensity that made even Jamal pause, his hand hovering over the register. Ethan took her silence as a challenge, his voice growing sharper, more insistent. "What's in the bag? You seem awfully protective of it." He nodded toward the satchel slung over her shoulder, his eyes narrowing. Layla raised an eyebrow, incredulity flashing across her face. "A laptop," she said flatly. "Is that a crime now?" "Let's see it," Ethan demanded, his voice loud enough to turn the heads of two customers lingering near the soda fountain. They shuffled awkwardly, clutching their drinks, unsure whether to stay or flee. Layla's response was ice cold, cutting through the rising noise. "No, you won't. I don't owe you an explanation, and you don't have probable cause." Her words were a wall, unyielding and precise, a reminder of the boundaries he was trampling. Ethan's smirk returned, but it was strained now, tinged with desperation. "Probable cause?" he mocked, stepping closer still. "Look at you, talking like some kind of lawyer. What, you think you're better than me, smarter than me?" Layla's reply was a blade, honed and exact. "I don't think," she said, her voice steady. "I know." The words hit like a thunderclap, reverberating in the small space. For a moment, the store fell silent, the tension so palpable it seemed the air itself might shatter. Ethan's face darkened, his hand drifting to his radio as if to summon backup, to escalate this into something neither of them could walk away from. Jamal, sensing the storm about to break, tried to intervene. "Officer, maybe we should just..." His voice was small, pleading, but Ethan cut him off with a snap. "Stay out of it," he barked, his eyes never leaving Layla. The line between justice and vengeance had blurred, dissolving into a haze of power and pride. What began as a routine stop in a convenience store had spiraled into a collision of wills, a microcosm of the forces that shaped them both. Layla's relentless pursuit of fairness, Ethan's clinging to a warped sense of order. The consequences of that day would stretch far beyond the flickering lights and stale air of the store, a ripple that would expose the fragility of justice when power went unchecked, leaving scars neither could outrun. The air in the cramped convenience store hung heavy, thick with the unspoken tension that crackled between Ethan Caldwell and Layla Foster. Ethan's voice had been sharp, slicing through the young man's words like a blade, leaving silence in its wake. His focus shifted abruptly, eyes locking onto Layla with a storm of emotions brewing beneath the surface: anger, frustration, and something darker, something he couldn't quite name. His boots thudded against the worn linoleum floor as he took a deliberate step forward, his broad frame casting a shadow over her. The fluorescent lights flickered faintly overhead, illuminating the hard lines of his face as he towered above her, his presence radiating a challenge. "You think you can just waltz in here, acting like you're untouchable?" he growled, his voice low and menacing, each syllable dripping with disdain. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." Layla stood her ground, her posture steady, unshaken by the weight of his glare. Her dark eyes met his without a hint of fear, piercing through the bravado he wore like armor. When she spoke, her voice was calm, measured, but there was an edge to it, a quiet strength that cut deeper than any shout. "No, Officer Caldwell," she said, letting his name hang in the air like a warning shot. "You don't know who you're messing with." The sound of his own name, spoken with such certainty, struck him like a jolt of electricity. For the first time, a shadow of doubt flickered across his face, his jaw tightening as the realization crept in. This wasn't the straightforward power play he'd assumed it to be. His mind raced, searching for a foothold, but before he could muster a response, the chime of the store's bell broke the spell. Another customer shuffled in, oblivious to the storm brewing just feet away, and the interruption forced Ethan to ease back, his confidence faltering but not yet shattered. Layla turned away from him, her movements deliberate as she collected her change from the counter. The coins clinked softly in her hand, a mundane sound that grounded her amidst the chaos of the moment. She walked toward the door, her steps unhurried, her silence louder than any retort. But as her fingers brushed the handle, Ethan's voice chased after her, brash and biting. "Don't think this is over," he called out, his tone laced with an arrogance that masked the unease gnawing at him. Layla paused, her hand resting on the cool metal, the weight of his words settling around her like a shroud. She didn't turn to face him, didn't give him the satisfaction. Instead, she let the moment stretch, the air thick with the unspoken promise of consequences, before pushing the door open and stepping into the blinding sunlight. Behind her, the store seemed to hold its breath, the tension lingering like smoke after a fire, a prelude to something far greater. Outside, the world felt sharper, more alive. The sun beat down relentlessly, glinting off the cracked pavement as Layla's mind churned not with fear, but with a fierce, unyielding purpose. Her heart pounded, not from the confrontation itself, but from the clarity it had given her. This wasn't over, not even close. Ethan Caldwell had no inkling of the chain of events he'd set in motion, no understanding of the fire he'd ignited. Soon, he'd face more than just her defiance. He'd face the unraveling of every lie, every abuse of power he'd buried beneath his badge. As she walked away, a faint smile tugged at the corners of her lips, knit a grin of triumph, but a quiet, knowing resolve. The game wasn't finished, it was only just beginning. And when the truth broke free, it wouldn't merely topple Ethan, it would expose the rot he'd thrived in, a reckoning for every injustice he'd assumed would stay buried. Across town, days later, the atmosphere in the FBI conference room was suffocating, every sound amplified in the stillness that gripped the space. Papers rustled as agents flipped through files, the projector hummed faintly in the background, and the clock on the wall ticked with a relentless rhythm that seemed to mock the gravity of the moment. Layla sat at the head of the table, her presence a force of natural commanding, unshakable, a beacon amidst the storm. Around her, a small circle of agents pored over the evidence spread before them, their faces a gallery of emotions, disbelief etched into furrowed brows, resolve hardening their jaws. The investigation into Officer Ethan Caldwell had gained momentum with startling speed after that fateful encounter at the convenience store. For Layla, this wasn't just a personal vendetta, it was a necessity, a duty born from the countless stories she'd heard, the lives she'd seen crushed under the weight of unchecked authority. The evidence was damning, a tapestry of corruption woven over years, complaints filed and ignored, disciplinary records buried under bureaucratic red tape, and most chilling of all, videos that laid bare Ethan's true nature. His aggression, his prejudice, his belief that the badge made him invincible, it was all there, captured in grainy footage that left no room for excuses. The centerpiece was the security tape from the store, a silent witness to the moment he'd crossed her. The agents had watched it countless times, the scene replaying like a haunting reel, Ethan's looming figure, the hostility in his voice, the way he'd grabbed her arm with a roughness that betrayed his intent, and the unshakable calm in Layla's eyes as she refused to bend. Each viewing peeled back another layer of the man he was, a tyrant cloaked in uniform, a predator who thrived on fear. A young agent named Daniels broke the silence, his voice trembling slightly with the weight of what he'd uncovered. "It's all here," he said, gesturing to the files scattered across the table. The excessive force complaints, the reports he twisted to cover his tracks, the pattern of targeting people, especially people of color. And now this. His hand swept toward the screen, where the frozen image of Ethan's confrontation with Layla loomed large, a testament to his arrogance. "This is undeniable." Layla nodded, her voice steady but resonant with conviction. "This isn't just about one officer," she said, her gaze sweeping the room. "It's about accountability. It's about proving that no one out of badge, not a title, stands above justice. If we let this slide, we're complicit in every life he's ruined, every voice he's silenced." Across the table, a seasoned investigator named Collins leaned forward, his weathered face etched with concern. He'd seen men like Ethan before too many times, and he knew the fight ahead wouldn't be easy. "He's not going to go quietly," Collins warned, his voice gravelly with experience. "Someone like Caldwell doesn't just roll over. He'll claw and scrape, twist every rule in the book to save himself." Layla's eyes narrowed, her resolve sharpening like a blade. "Let him try," she said, her tone icy with determination. "The truth doesn't bend, and the evidence doesn't lie." He can fight all he wants, it won't change what's coming. As the meeting drew to a close, the agents filed out, their footsteps echoing in the hall, but Layla lingered. She stared at the darkened screen, the memory of Ethan's grip on her arm still vivid, a visceral reminder of why she'd chosen this path. This wasn't just her battle, it was for every person who'd been dismissed, every victim justice had failed, every future that hung in the balance if men like Ethan went unchecked. Meanwhile, miles away, Ethan sat in the driver's seat of his squad car. The hum of the engine, a faint comfort against the unease he refused to acknowledge. Whispers of an internal investigation had reached him, murmurs from colleagues. Vague warnings from the precinct boot, he brushed them off as noise. The petty gripes of a system, too soft to understand the streets. He'd navigated worse, always emerging unscathed. His confidence bolstered by years of camaraderie and the department's willful blindness. He leaned back, staring out at the dusk settling over the city, convinced he could bend this storm to his will as he always had. The radio crackled, jolting him from his thoughts, a summons to the precinct, urgent and clipped. He sighed, irritation flaring as he shifted the car into gear, the weight of the day pressing down on him like an unwelcome passenger. When he arrived, the precinct felt different. The usual buzz of chatter and clatter was muted, replaced by a stillness that set his nerves on edge. Officers glanced his way, their eyes darting away too quickly, and the air hummed with unspoken anticipation. Captain Rodriguez waited in her office, her stern figure framed by the dim light filtering through the blinds. Her face was a mask, unreadable, but her posture was rigid, a sentinel guarding a truth Ethan couldn't yet see. He stepped inside, his usual swagger faltering as his gaze landed on the folder on her desk. A single photograph peeked out as still from the convenience store footage, his own face staring back at him, frozen in a moment of unchecked rage. A cold shiver snaked down his spine, but he forced a smirk, leaning casually against the doorframe. "What's this about, Captain?" he asked, his voice laced with a bravado he didn't fully feel. Rodriguez gestured to the chair across from her, her tone brooking no argument. "Sit." Reluctantly, he obeyed, his mind racing as she opened the folder, her eyes scanning the contents before locking onto his. "We've received a formal complaint," she began, her words measured and deliberate, "backed by substantial evidence about your conduct last week, specifically your interaction with a civilian at a convenience store." Ethan scoffed, slumping back in the chair, his arms crossing defiantly. "You've got to be kidding me. That was nothing, just doing my job, keeping things under control." Her expression hardened, a flicker of disgust breaking through her composure. "Your job doesn't include harassment, excessive force, or abusing your authority," she snapped. "The evidence paints a very different picture, Yon. You can't talk your way out of." He bristled, leaning forward, desperation creeping into his tone. "Come on, Captain. You know how it is out there. People don't respect the badge anymore. Sometimes you've got to show them who's in charge." Rodriguez's voice dropped, cold and unyielding. "Show them who's in charge. Is that what you think this is? This isn't the first time we've had complaints about you, Caldwell. But it's the first time we've had proof this airtight. Do you even know who that woman was?" Confusion clouded his face, unease tightening his chest. "What are you talking about?" he muttered, his bravado crumbling. Rodriguez leaned closer, her voice a quiet thunder. "That civilian you manhandled. She's Captain Layla Foster, head of an FBI task force, and she's the one leading the investigation into you. She could end your career with a whisper." The color drained from Ethan's face, his breath catching as the enormity of her words crashed over him. He opened his mouth to protest, but no sound came. Rodriguez pressed on, relentless. "You're on administrative leave, effective immediately, pending the investigation's outcome. Turn in your badge and gun." His hands shook as he reached for the badge pinned to his chest, the metal cold against his fingers. In that moment, the weight of his actions saw off every choice he'd made. Every line he'd crossed had settled over him like a noose. Justice, it seemed, had a way of catching up, and the consequences of his arrogance were only just beginning to unfold. The metallic clatter of Ethan's badge hitting the desk reverberated through the room, a hollow, mournful sound that seemed to echo the turmoil churning inside him. He stood there for a moment, frozen, his fingers lingering over the cold surface of the desk as if reluctant to let go of the last. tethered to the life he'd known. His mind was a storm, thoughts crashing against one another, frantic and disjointed, searching desperately for some hidden path, some clever excuse that might pull him from the quicksand swallowing him whole. But the walls of his reality pressed closer with every heartbeat, their unyielding presence a silent promise. There was no way out. He turned and stepped out of the office, his boots thudding dully against the polished floor. The air felt thick with the weight of his colleagues' stare, some wide with pity, others narrowed in disdain, all of them cutting into him like shards of glass. Men and women he'd stood shoulder to shoulder with for years now watched him, as though he were a stranger, an outsider cast out from their ranks. For the first time in his career, Ethan felt the ground shift beneath him. The unshakable authority he'd worn like armor stripped away in an instant. The badge he'd once wielded with such reckless confidence was gone, and with it, the illusion of control he'd clung to so fiercely. Little did he know, this moment was merely the opening note of a symphony of reckoning that would unravel everything. He thought he was. Later, Ethan found himself in a cramped, dimly lit interrogation room at the FBI field office, a space that smelled faintly of stale coffee and regret. The steel chair beneath him was unforgiving, its icy surface biting into his back as he shifted uncomfortably. His hands rested on the scratched metal table, fingers twitching restlessly, as though searching for the phantom weight of his badge or the reassuring grip of his surrendered gun. The absence of those familiar symbols gnawed at him, a ghostly pull dragging at his chest, reminding him of what he'd lost. The silence in the room was suffocating, broken only by the faint, incessant hum of a flickering fluorescent bulb. Overhead, a sound that grated against his nerves, like a dull blade. He wasn't used to this side of the table, this powerless perch where the accused sat, waiting for judgment. Unease clawed at his gut, sharp and insistent. But he clenched his jaw and forced his face into a mask of defiance. He wouldn't let them see him break. The door creaked open, and Lila stepped inside, her presence a quiet storm that filled the room without effort. She didn't need to slam the door or stride in with theatrical bravado or authority. Was a tide, rising steadily, undeniable. In her hands, she carried a thin folder, its edges worn from handling, the same one Ethan had glimpsed earlier on Captain Rodriguez's desk. She sat across from him, placing the folder on the table with a deliberate slowness that made his stomach twist. His instinct screamed at him to speak, to seize control of this spiraling nightmare. "This has to be some kind of joke, right?" he said, his voice rough with forced bravado. "I mean, what are we even doing here?" Lila's eyes locked onto his, steady and unyielding, a gaze that pierced through his flimsy shield of confidence. When she spoke, her voice was calm, measured, but carried an edge sharper than any shout. "Do you think this is a joke, Officer Caldwell? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks far more serious than that." Her words landed like stones, heavy and unmovable, and Ethan felt the first crack in his resolve. He leaned back, folding his arms across his chest as if they could protect him from the truth bearing down on him. All this over some misunderstanding at a convenience store. He shot back, his tone dripping with defiance. "You're blowing this way out of proportion. I was just doing my job." Lila tilted her head slightly, studying him with a quiet intensity that made him feel exposed, like a puzzle she'd already solved but was piecing together again for her own clarity. "Your job," she repeated, her voice low and deliberate. "Harassment, profiling, physical intimidation, are those part of your job description, Ethan?" His jaw tightened, frustration simmering just beneath his skin, threatening to boil over. "Look," he snapped, "I don't know what you think you saw, but you don't get it. You don't know what it's like out there. People don't respect the badge anymore. They push back. They challenge you at every turn. Sometimes you have to show them who's in charge." Her lips pressed into a thin, hard line, and her hands folded neatly on the table, a gesture that belied the storm brewing in her eyes. When she spoke again, her voice was colder, each word a precise cut. "Show them who's in charge. That's how you justify it, not just to me, but to everyone you've targeted over the years. People whose lives you've upended because their very existence made you feel small." Ethan's face flushed, a hot rush of anger and shame flooding his cheeks. He leaned forward, his voice rising, raw with desperation. "I don't target anyone. I've spent years on the force, protecting the city, dealing with criminals, cleaning up the streets. Maybe if you stepped out of your cushy office and into the real world, you'd see how things actually work. Lila didn't flinch. Her gaze remained an anchor, steady and unshaken. Her voice cutting through his outburst like a blade through smoke. I've spent my entire career in the real world, Officer Caldwell. The difference is, I've done it without letting fear and prejudice twist my actions into something ugly. The weight of her words pressed down on him, cracking the brittle walls he'd built around himself. He wanted to push back, to hurl more defenses into the fray, but the folder between them sat like a loaded gun, its contents a silent threat he couldn't ignore. His voice wavered, a tangle of anger and doubt. You don't know me. You don't know what I've been through or why I do what I do. For the first time, Lila leaned in, her calm exterior giving way to something fiercer, more personal. You're right, he don't know you. But I know the wreckage left by men like you. I know the fear you sow in people who've done nothing to deserve it. The lives you shatter because you think your badge makes you untouchable. A god among men. Ethan's eyes darted away, flickering to the folder as if it might combust under his gaze. This is ridiculous, he muttered, his voice brittle. I've done my job the best I could. Nobody's perfect. Without a word, Lila opened the folder and slid a single photograph across the table. It was a still from the convenience store footage. Frozen in time's moment, his hand had clamped around her arm, his face twisted with unchecked power. She pressed her finger to the image, her voice softening but losing none of its bite. Does this look like doing your job, Ethan? Does this look like protecting and serving? He stared at the photo, the silence stretching taut between them, louder than any argument he could muster. Lila's voice gained strength, a quiet fury building. This isn't about one bad day or one mistake. This is a pattern, a legacy of abuse, of power run wild. You think you're protecting something, but all you've done is tear it apart. His fists clenched, knuckles whitening, his voice dropping to a low, bitter growl. You've already made up your mind about me, haven't you? You're just here to watch me squirm. Lila's expression softened, but only a fraction, her resolve unwavering. This isn't about watching you squirm, Ethan. This is about accountability, about making sure the next person you decide to remind, who's in charge, doesn't have to bear the scars of your choices. The room fell silent again, the air thick with tension, a weight that pressed against his chest until he could hardly breathe. His defenses were crumbling, brick by brick, but he wasn't ready to surrender yet. He looked up at her, his voice trembling with something raw, almost vulnerable. And what happens now? You're just going to ruin my life. Take everything I've worked for. Her gaze softened further, though her strength remained a quiet force. You ruined your own life. Ethan, the choices you made, the people you hurt were yours to make. This isn't about taking something from you. It's about ensuring no one else pays the price for your failures. He slumped back in the chair, shoulders sagging under the unbearable truth. The room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in tighter, the air heavy with the stench of his own unraveling. He'd spent his life crafting an image of protector, the enforcer, the man who held chaos at bay. But now, staring into the abyss of his actions, he saw it for what it was, a fragile lie built on fear, propped up by the suffering of others. Lila rose, gathering the folder and tucking it under her arm. She looked down at him, her voice quiet but resolute. This isn't the end for you, Ethan. What happens next is your choice. You can fight the truth, cling to your denial, or you can face yourself, decide what kind of man you want to be. She turned and walked away, her footsteps a steady rhythm in the stillness, the door clicking shut behind her with a finality that echoed in his bones. He didn't call after her, didn't scramble for one last defense. He was alone now, left with the weight of her words, the damning evidence before him, and the dawning realization that the reckoning he'd dreaded was no longer a shadow on the horizon. It was here, and it was his to face. Hours later, Ethan sat in his small apartment, the distant hum of the city seeping through a cracked window. The space, once a shrine to his pride, now felt like a cage. Framed commendations hung crooked on the walls, their polished plaques dulled by dust and doubt. Photographs from precinct events, smiling faces, raised beers. Moments of camaraderie stared back at him, mocking the man he'd become. A stack of case files, once meticulously organized, teetered on the edge of a table. a monument to a career he no longer recognized. Every item in the room, every relic of his service, whispered the same accusation. You thought you were righteous, but you were wrong. He replayed Lila's words in his mind, each repetition slicing deeper, peeling back layers of self-deception he'd worn like a second skin. Accountability, responsibility, concepts he'd wielded like weapons against other suspects, civilians. Anyone who dared cross his path turned inward, their edges razor-sharp. The convenience store footage played on an endless loop in his head. The way he'd grabbed her arm, the sneer twisting his face, the casual brutality he'd dismissed as necessity. It wasn't just a single moment, it was a mirror, reflecting years of choices he'd buried under bravado and justification. The lesson was brutal, unyielding. Justice wasn't his to bend, and power, when abused, left a trail of ruin that eventually circled back to its source. He'd spent his career believing he stood above consequence, that the badge shielded him from the fallout of his actions. But now, stripped bare, he saw the cost lives he'd disrupted, the fear he'd sown, the trust he'd shattered. And as he sat there, alone in the dim glow of a flickering lamp, Ethan understood that this wasn't just about losing his badge or facing punishment. It was about confronting the man he'd allowed himself to become in the long, painful road to clawing his way back from the wreckage. Ethan sat alone in his dimly lit apartment, the faint hum of Atlanta's restless streets filtering through the cracked window. The record of his actions lay sprawled across his mind like a shattered mirror, each jagged piece reflecting a version of himself he could no longer ignore. The precinct, once a hive of activity where his name carried weight, had fallen silent since his suspension. His phone, which used to vibrate incessantly with calls from colleagues seeking advice, others barking orders, rested motionless on the chipped kitchen counter, a lifeless slab of metal and glass. The quiet was suffocating, a relentless void that pressed against his chest and forced him to face the thoughts he'd buried beneath years of bravado and routine. What had driven him to this point? Was it the grinding frustration of a job that never seemed to yield results? The gnawing stress of watching a city spiral deeper into disorder despite his efforts? Or was it something uglier? A shadow lurking in the corners of his soul of fear he'd never dared to name. A dread of losing the control he'd clung to like a lifeline? Across town, in a cluttered office bathed in the sterile glow of fluorescent lights, Layla hunched over her desk, her brow furrowed as she sifted through the latest threads of the investigation. The evidence had been painstakingly gathered, a mountain of documents and testimonies that now pointed toward an inevitable conclusion. She leaned back in her chair, her gaze drifting to the corkboard dominating the wall before her. It was a chaotic tapestry of photographs, timelines, and scribbled notes, all tethered together by a web of red string that seemed to pulse with the weight of the truth it held. At the center of it all was Ethan's face, his stern jaw and piercing eyes staring back at her from a grainy precinct ID photo. The task force had unearthed a troubling history, falsified reports, arrests marked by unchecked aggression, and a chilling pattern of targeting minority neighborhoods with a zeal that bordered on cruelty. The deeper they dug, the more Layla realized Ethan wasn't just an anomaly, a rogue cop gone astray. He was a symptom, a festering wound on the body of a department riddled with rot, a system that had nurtured his excesses and turned a blind eye to the wreckage he left behind. Layla's fingers traced the edge of a file as she stared at Ethan's image, her mind wrestling with a storm of emotions. She didn't forgive him, his actions were too grave, the harm too deep for absolution, but a flicker of empathy stirred within her. It wasn't pity, nor was it softness. It was the reluctant recognition that Ethan hadn't emerged from a vacuum. He was a product of a machine that chewed up good intentions and spat out broken men, a system that rewarded power over principle and left justice to fend for itself. She saw the faces of his victims in her mind, families torn apart, voices silenced, and felt the weight of their pain settle into her bones. This wasn't just about one man's fall. It was about the countless lives crushed under the heel of a structure that had failed them all. A sharp knock at the door snapped her from her reverie. Colin stepped inside, his broad frame filling the doorway, his face etched with a seriousness that carried no trace of hostility. He held a thick folder in his hands, its edges worn from hours of scrutiny. "We've finalized the report," he said, his voice steady as he placed it on her desk with a soft thud. "The evidence is airtight. It's time to move forward." Layla nodded, her fingers brushing the folder's cover as if testing its reality. Colin lingered, his breath catching before he spoke again. "He's not fighting it, not yet, at least. He's been quiet since the suspension. No appeals, no rants to the press. It's like he's just waiting for the end." Layla's eyes flicked up to meet his, then returned to the folder. She closed it with a decisive snap, her resolve hardening like steel. "Then we make sure it ends the right way," she said, her voice low but firm. "This isn't just about Ethan, Colin. It's about sending a signal to the department, to the city, to every soul watching. We're not just toppling one man. We're dragging an entire system into the light and demanding it answer for its sins." Meanwhile, Ethan roamed the streets of Atlanta, his boots scuffing against uneven pavement, his path aimless yet burdened with purpose. He steered clear of the old haunts, dive bars where off-duty officers swapped war stories, over cheap beer, the coffee shop where the barista once greeted him with a familiar nod. Instead, he drifted into unfamiliar corners of the city, neighborhoods he'd once written off as dens of chaos or irrelevance. The air here smelled different, sharp, with the tang of paint, and earth in the walls bore murals that blazed with color, scenes of unity and defiance etched onto crumbling brick. They stood in defiance of the cold, calculating lens through which he'd always viewed these streets, a lens that reduced lives to numbers and threats. He paused outside a community center, drawn by the sound of laughter spilling through the open windows. Inside, children darted between tables, their voices bright with joy, while adults huddled in earnest conversation, their faces alight with a resilience he couldn't fathom. Ethan pressed a hand to the glass, his reflection a ghostly overlay against the scene within. When had he stopped seeing hope here? When had he let suspicion and control twist his view into something so narrow, so hollow? The next morning, a summons arrived, its crisp envelope stark against the clutter of his kitchen table. Ethan's gut twisted as he tore it open, though he'd known this day was coming. The precinct loomed ahead when he arrived, its gray facade as imposing as ever, the air thick with tension. Whispers trailed him like a swarm of flies as he walked the familiar halls, his former colleagues' eyes darting away when he met their gaze. Captain Rodriguez waited in her office, her posture rigid, her expression a mask he couldn't crack. She slid a letter across the desk, formal, final, detailing his termination and the charges that loomed on the horizon. Her voice was steady, each word a hammer striking stone. "This isn't just about you, Caldwell," she said, her tone devoid of warmth but not cruel. "This is about drawing a line. We can't let this slide not anymore." Ethan's throat tightened, words failing him as he nodded mutely. He left the precinct a civilian, the badge that had once been his armor stripped away, leaving him bare and unmoored. He was no longer Officer Caldwell, the iron fist of order. He was just Ethan, a man staring into the abyss of what came next. That evening, Layla stood on her balcony, the city's lights sprawling before her like a constellation of dreams and despair. The news blared from her living room, headlines trumpeting Ethan's dismissal and the legal storm gathering around him. The public's response was a cacophony. Some cheered it as a triumph of justice. Others raged against it as a betrayal of the badge. But for Layla, the noise faded into the background. This wasn't about applause or outrage. It was about the slow, unglamorous work of dismantling a system that had grown rotten at its core, about planting seeds for a future where power didn't excuse brutality. She gripped the railing, the cool metal grounding her as she vowed to press on, knowing the fight was far from over. Back in his apartment, Ethan slumped at the table, the crumpled termination letter a silent accusation beside his untouched coffee. The walls seemed to close in, adorned with faded photos and commendations from a life that no longer fit. He traced the edge of a frame with his thumb, his mind churning. Redemption felt like a foreign word, its shape unfamiliar on his tongue. Could he rebuild? Could he unmake the man he'd become? For the first time, he didn't shy from the question. He sat with the discomfort, letting it seep into him, a bitter medicine for a soul long numbed. Morning crept in, casting slanted beams across the floor of Ethan's apartment. The space felt hollow, stripped of the purpose that had once fueled it. His uniform lay folded in a box, shoved into the closet's shadows. The badge, a discarded relic of a past he could scarcely recognize. He stared into his cold coffee, the surface reflecting a man adrift. A knock jolted him upright, his pulse quickening as he crossed the room. Captain Rodriguez stood on the threshold, her presence as formidable as ever. Though she wore a simple blazer instead of her uniform, her eyes swept over him, unreadable yet piercing. "Can I come in?" she asked, her voice cutting through the silence. Ethan stepped aside, gesturing her toward the sagging couch. She surveyed the room's scattered papers, the stale air before settling in, her posture deliberate. "I'm not here to preach," she began, leaning forward, her elbows braced on her knees. "You've had enough of that. But we need to talk about what's next. The badge is gone, but the consequences aren't." Ethan rubbed the back of his neck, the weight of her words sinking in. "I figured you'd said all there was to say," he muttered, a bitter edge creeping into his tone. Rodriguez's gaze sharpened, though her voice remained even. "This isn't about me proving a point, Ethan. It's about accountability, yours, the department's, all of it. You abused power, and people suffered. But the system let you. That's the lesson here. Justice isn't just punishment. It's tearing down what's broken so it can't happen again." Her words hung heavy, a mirror held up to his choices and the machinery that had enabled them. Ethan looked away, his jaw tight, but he couldn't escape the truth she laid bare. Across the city, Layla watched the dawn break, the horizon streaked with gold and shadow. Ethan's story was a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of power's seductive pull and the ruin it wrought when unchecked. But it was also a spark, igniting a broader reckoning. The consequences of his actions would ripple outward, touching lives in ways neither of them could predict. In those ripples lay the faint promise of progress, not perfection, but a chance to build something stronger, something truer. For Ethan, the road ahead was uncertain, a path he'd have to carve from the wreckage of his past. For Layla, it was a call to keep fighting, to shape a world where justice wasn't just a word, but a living, breathing force. Their stories weren't over, they were intertwined, bound by the choices they'd made and the futures they'd yet to claim. Ethan Caldwell sat alone in the dim glow of his living room, the faint hum of the city filtering through the cracked window. Every day, the same relentless thoughts clawed at him, mistakes he'd buried deep, now clawing their way to the surface, and the faces of those he'd wounded with his choices flickering like ghosts in his mind. It wasn't just regret, it was a loop, a broken record of guilt that spun endlessly, filling the silence with accusations he couldn't outrun. Across from him, Detective Maria Rodriguez reclined in her chair, her sharp eyes tracing every twitch of his expression. She'd seen men like him before, haunted, teetering on the edge of something they couldn't name. "Good," she said, her voice steady but laced with an edge of challenge. "You should think about it. But dwelling on it won't cut it, Ethan. If you want to climb out of that hole you've dug, you've got to act." Her words struck him like a slap, stirring the frustration that simmered just beneath his skin. Ethan's hands clenched into fists as he leaned forward, his voice rough with exasperation. "Act. What am I supposed to do, Rodriguez? Walk up to every person I've wronged and beg for forgiveness? Stand on some street corner with a cardboard signery I screwed up? It's useless. People have already judged me. Their minds are made up." His chest tightened as he spoke, the weight of public scorn pressing down on him like a physical force. He could still feel the eyes of strangers, neighbors, old colleagues, even the cashier at the corner store watching him with that mix of pity and disdain. Rodriguez didn't flinch. Her gaze softened, but her words cut deeper, precise as a surgeon's blade. "This isn't about what they think of you, Caldwell. It's about what you do with the ugly truth staring you in the face. You hid behind that badge for years, telling yourself you were the hero, that every call you made was righteous. Power's a hell of a drudge. It lets you rewrite the story until you're the only one who believes it. Now, you've got a choice. Keep dodging the mirror or step up and own what you've done." She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a near whisper, forcing him to feel the gravity of her point. "Justice isn't a gift you get handed. It's a debt you pay." Ethan's jaw locked tight, his teeth grinding as her words sank in. The truth wasn't just heavy, it was suffocating, a lead blanket draped over his shoulders. He wanted to argue, to shove her logic away, but a tiny spark flickered inside him. fragile and unfamiliar. Hope, maybe redemption. He didn't know what to call it, but it lingered, gnawing at his defenses as he sat there, silent and brooding. Rodriguez watched him wrestle with it, her expression unreadable. Before she stood and left him alone with his thoughts, days bled into weeks, and that spark refused to die. Ethan started stepping out more, not to flee the chaos in his head, but to face it head-on. He wandered the streets he'd once patrolled as a cop, his old precinct jacket swapped for a faded hoodie. The neighborhoods looked different now, less like a battlefield, more like a patchwork of lives he'd never bothered to understand. Kids darted past him, laughing as they kicked a deflated soccer ball. Mothers chatted on stoops, their voices warm despite the weariness in their eyes. He'd once seen these places through a lens of suspicion, every shadow a threat, every face a potential perp. Now, he saw the humanity he'd ignored, and it hollowed him out. At the community center down on 14th Street, Ethan found himself volunteering first just to fill the empty hours, then because he couldn't stay away. The old brick building buzzed with life, parents juggling jobs and dreams, kids scribbling in notebooks or shooting hoops, teachers with tired smiles coaxing hope out of chaos. He listened to their stories raw, unfiltered tales of struggle and stubborn resilience, and each one carved into him, exposing the depth of the damage he'd done. Not just the arrests, the barked orders, the lives he'd upended, but the indifference he'd worn like armor. He'd been a cog in a machine that crushed more than it fixed, and the realization left him sleepless, staring at the ceiling night after night. One humid afternoon, as he hauled folding chairs into the gymnasium for a youth basketball game, he caught sight of Layla Foster near the entrance. Captain Layla Foster, tall, unyielding, her presence commanding the room without effort. Her dark hair was pulled back tight, her uniform crisp even in the sticky heat, and her eyes scanned the space with the calm vigilance of someone who'd seen it all. She'd been invited to talk to the kids about leadership, about pushing through when the world tried to break you. But when she spotted Ethan, her stride faltered, her gaze narrowing as if she were sizing up a suspect. He approached her slowly, hands buried in his pockets, shoulders hunched like a kid caught sneaking in late. "Captain Foster," he started, his voice cracking slightly. "Didn't think I'd run into you here." She arched an eyebrow, her tone cool and guarded. "Funny, I could say the same about you, Caldwell." He shifted his weight, glancing at the scuffed linoleum before meeting her eyes. "I've been coming here, volunteering, trying to, I don't know, do something that matters, I guess." His words felt clumsy, inadequate, like they couldn't carry the weight of what he meant. Layla studied him, her face a mask of skepticism. After a long, tense silence, she spoke, her voice deliberate. "Meaningful isn't a finish line you cross, Ethan. It's a grind. You don't wipe out years of harm with a couple of good deeds." Her words weren't cruel, but they were unsparing, and they hit him square in the chest. "I know," he said quickly, desperation creeping into his tone. "I'm not trying to erase it. I just need to make things right, or at least try." His hands fidgeted in his pockets, betraying the storm inside him. Layla crossed her arms, her stare unrelenting. "Making things right isn't a solo project. It's facing the people you've hurt, the communities you've torn apart. It's being brutally honest with them and yourself. You don't get to decide when the slate's clean." Ethan swallowed hard, her bluntness knocking the air out of him. "I don't even know where to begin," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. For a fleeting moment, Layla's expression softened, a crack in her armor. "You start by shutting up and listening, by getting it through your head that this isn't about you, it's about the people who've been picking up the pieces you left behind." Her words stuck to him like damp clothes, heavy and inescapable. After she walked away, Ethan threw himself into community meetings, sitting in the back of stuffy church basements or crowded rec rooms. He wasn't Officer Caldwell anymore. Barking orders or flashing his badge was just a man, listening. The stories poured out. Mothers who'd lost sons to a system he'd upheld. Fathers working 3 jobs to keep the lights on. Kids who dreamed big despite the odds. Pain and strength wove through every word, and Ethan felt the scope of his complicity expand with each one. Justice, he realized, wasn't about his guilt, it was about their survival. And he'd been on the wrong side of it for too long. Layla kept her distance, a silent observer perched on the edges of his efforts. She wasn't one for fairy tale turnarounds or tearful apologies, seeing too many promises evaporate into nothing. But as weeks turned to months, she noticed the shift in him, the way he lingered after meetings to ask questions, the quiet way he helped stack chairs or pour coffee. It wasn't absolution, not even close, but it was something growth, maybe, or the faint outline of accountability. She didn't trust it yet, but she didn't dismiss it either. Late one afternoon, the sun spilled golden light across the community center's gym, where kids chased a basketball across the worn floorboards. Their shouts bounced off the walls, a chaotic symphony that clashed with the turmoil churning in Ethan's gut. Volunteering had stripped him bereavement conversation. Every wary glance from a parent or a teen reminded him of the lives he'd once reduced to reports and rap sheets. He wasn't sure if they accepted him or just tolerated him, but he kept showing up, driven by a need he couldn't name. Layla slipped in quietly, her boots silent against the floor. She hadn't come for him, she was there to check on the program. But when their eyes met across the gym, something unspoken passed between them, a thread of recognition tangled in their shared history. She crossed the room, her posture as steady as ever, her expression a careful balance of calm and scrutiny. "Still here," she said, her voice even but tinged with a faint curiosity. Ethan nodded, hands stuffed in his pockets again, a nervous habit he couldn't shake. Figured it beats sitting home, staring at the walls. She tilted her head, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Is it working, or are you just playing at being useful?" The question stung, peeling back layers he'd rather keep covered. He hesitated, then answered, quieter now. "I don't know what working looks like. I don't even know if it's possible. But I'm here." Her gaze softened, just a fraction, though her tone stayed firm. "It's not about working. It's about owning it, showing up when it's messy, when people won't look you in the eye, when forgiveness isn't on the table. You don't get to fix this, Ethan. You get to carry it." He shifted, uncomfortable under her scrutiny, his eyes dropping to the floor. "What if they never forgive me? What if this is all for nothing?" Layla's response came steady and sure. "You're not here for their forgiveness. You're here for their truth. They decide if and when they let you in at you." Ethan nodded slowly, her words settling into him like stones in a riverbed. "I'm trying," he said after a beat, his voice raw. "I don't know if it counts, but I am." Layla tilted her head, sizing him up. "Trying's a start, but it's not the finish line. If you mean it, you keep going no matter how ugly it gets, no matter who turns you away." Her phone buzzed, pulling her attention. She glanced at it, her face tightening briefly. "I've got to run," she said, then paused, her voice dipping softer. "Don't waste this, Caldwell. Not everyone gets a shot to turn it around." She left, her words ringing in his ears. That night, Ethan sat in the back of another community meeting, the air thick with the smell of instant coffee and old wood. The faces around him were familiar, no people who nodded faintly when he arrived, who no longer whispered when he passed. As the discussion wound down, the facilitator, a weary woman named Ms. Carter with a voice like gravel, asked if anyone had final thoughts. Ethan's hand shot up before he could second-guess it, surprising even himself. He stood, the room falling quiet, dozens of eyes pinning him in place. His throat tightened, but he forced the words out, raw and unsteady. "I've been coming here a while, listening. I used to be a cop, some of you know that. Some of you probably hate me for it. I don't blame you. I spent years thinking I was keeping things right, but I was breaking them instead. I hurt people, your people, this place. I can't undo that. But I'm here because I want to try, however long it takes." His voice cracked, and he sat down fast, heart hammering. The room stayed silent for a moment. Then Ms. Carter nodded, her lips pursed but not unkind. No one clapped or cheered. There were no Hollywood endings here, but a few heads tilted, considering him. Across town, Layla heard about it later from a friend, her coffee pausing halfway to her mouth. She didn't smile, but her eyes flickered with something close to respect. Ethan wasn't redeemed, not by a long shot, but he was moving, stumbling, maybe, toward a justice that wasn't his to claim, but theirs to define. And in that messy, unglamorous struggle, there was a lesson. Power abused leaves scars, but accountability, however late, can plant seeds for something better. The The room fell into a hushed stillness, the kind that presses against your ears and amplifies every breath. Ethan stood at its center, his heart hammering so fiercely he could feel it reverberating through his ribs, a wild drumbeat urging him to flee. Yet he stayed, rooted to the spot, his voice trembling as it broke the silence, hesitant but resolute. I don't really know how to start this," he admitted, the words stumbling out like a confession he'd rehearsed 1,000 times in his mind, but never dared to speak aloud. "But I feel like I have to say something." His eyes darted around the room, meeting the gazes of those seated before himphoses etched with scars he'd helped carve, people who had every right to despise him. The air was thick with their unspoken judgment, yet he pressed on, driven by a need he couldn't fully name. "I've messed up, more times than I can count. I've hurt people right here, people in this community. I can't take back what I've done, but I want to own it. I want to figure out how to be better, how to do better." The silence that followed wasn't sharp or accusing. It was a heavy, contemplative thing, pregnant with the weight of his words and the raw emotions they stirred. Ethan stood there, vulnerable under the scrutiny, waiting for the storm he half expected to erupt. Instead, one by one, voices rose from the crowd, not to forgive him, not to wipe his slate clean, but to lay bare their truths. A young man spoke first, his voice tight with remembered fear, recounting the night Ethan's actions had left him trembling in the dark, unsure if he'd see morning. A woman followed, her tone laced with bitterness, describing the anger that had festered in her chest for months, the pain of betrayal from someone meant to protect. They didn't soften their stories, didn't spare him the jagged edges of their experiences, and Ethan didn't flinch. He listened, truly listened, letting their words seep into the hollow places where he'd once stashed excuses and self-righteous defenses. Each syllable was a mirror, reflecting the man he'd been and the wreckage he'd left behind. When the meeting drew to a close, the crowd thinned, but an older woman lingered. She approached him slowly, her steps deliberate, her face a map of wariness tempered by something softer, not kindness exactly, but an absence of malice. Her gray hair framed eyes that had seen too much, and when she spoke, her voice was steady, carrying the weight of years. "You've got a long road ahead, son," she said, her tone firm yet not unkind. "But showing up here, facing this, it's a start." Ethan's throat tightened, emotion clawing its way up until it nearly choked him. "Thank you," he managed, the words barely a whisper, fragile as glass. Her nod was curt, but her gaze lingered a moment longer, as if measuring the sincerity behind his gratitude. Weeks bled into months, and Ethan threw himself into the community not with grand gestures or a savior's swagger, but with the quiet determination of a man learning to see. He volunteered at the food pantry, his hands trembling slightly as he handed out bags to faces he'd once dismissed. He showed up at town events, standing awkwardly on the fringes, absorbing conversations he'd never bothered with before. Each interaction was a gauntlet, a reminder of the harm he'd sown, every sidelong glance, every hesitant greeting a testament to the trust he'd shattered. Yet it also revealed the staggering resilience of those around him, people who could have shut him out forever, but instead chose to hold him to account, in ways that stung and mended in equal measure. Leia watched from a distance, her sharp eyes tracking his every move, not out of duty, but a wary curiosity that gnawed at her. She'd known Ethan in his arrogance, his uniform a shield he'd wielded like a weapon. Now she saw the shift, the way his shoulders no longer squared with pride, the way his voice softened when he spoke. The community noticed too, not with warm embraces or tearful reconciliations, but with a grudging nod here, a muttered acknowledgement there. He was trying, and that effort, however imperfect, was real. For Leia, it wasn't a fairy tale ending or a neatly tied bow. It was something messier, truer. One evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the city in hues of amber and shadow, Ethan found himself outside the community center. His gaze settled on the mural adorning its wall, a vivid tapestry of figures clasped in unity, their strength a rebuke to the divisions he'd once fueled. He reached out, fingertips grazing the rough, painted bricks, and a flicker of hope ignited in his chest, not for absolution, but for the chance to become something more. Months later, Ethan's life bore little resemblance to the one he'd known. The badge that had once defined him, A symbol of authority he'd twisted to justify his worst impulses was gone. In its place was a man shaped by daily choice to mend, to listen, to show up. The community center had become his refuge, its worn floors and chipped walls a second home. He worked there quietly, hauling boxes or sweeping floors alongside people he'd once eyed with suspicion, their laughter and murmured conversations weaving a fragile thread of connection. His efforts didn't erase the past. Acceptance wasn't a prize handed out freely. Forgiveness, he'd come to understand, wasn't a demand he could make. It was a slow, delicate gift, earned through time and unwavering accountability. One crisp afternoon, the annual community summit filled the auditorium with a restless energy. Ethan sat near the back, his presence unobtrusive, his intent simply to absorb the voices of those he'd once ignored. He hadn't come to speak, hadn't even considered it content to let the event unfold around him. But as the facilitator opened the floor, a voice cut through the hum, sharp and clear, "Ethan." The room stilled, every head swiveling toward him, a sea of eyes brimming with curiosity and doubt. The facilitator beckoned, and though his pulse roared in his ears, Ethan rose, legs unsteady as he approached the microphone. The weight of their stares pressed against him, a tangible force. But he squared his shoulders and spoke. "I didn't prepare anything," he began, his voice steady despite the tremor beneath it. "I didn't expect to be up here. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that showing up matters even when it's hard, even when you don't know what to say." He paused, scanning the crowd, meeting eyes that held both pain and possibility. "I've done things I regret. I've hurt people, made assumptions, acted in ways that betrayed everything I thought I believed in. I'm sorry. I know words don't fix the past, but I hope my actions can prove I'm serious about doing right, not for applause or a clean slate, but because it's what's owed." The silence that followed was a living thing, dense and charged. He returned the mic and sank back into his seat, heart still pounding. The applause, when it came, was soft but earnest, a quiet recognition of his effort. And for Ethan, that was enough. For Leia, the months since Ethan's reckoning had been a tempest of progress and frustration. His case had ignited a firestorm, forcing conversations about accountability that rippled beyond their small corner of the world. New policies, emerged trainings on bias, reforms to peel back layers of systemic rot. It wasn't a cure, but a beginning. Late one evening, alone in her office, surrounded by reports and flickering lamplight, she paused to reflect. Ethan's journey, so flawed, so human, stood in stark contrast to the countless stories that never got the chance to shift. It fueled her, a reminder of why she fought, why she refused to relent. Their paths crossed again at a community event, an unplanned convergence beneath a sky streaked with dusk. When their eyes met across the bustling crowd, the air between them held no rancor, just a quiet, hard-earned understanding. Leia approached first, her steps measured, her voice even but warm. "You've come a long way, Ethan," she said, her words a bridge rather than a judgment. He nodded, humility softening his features. "I've still got miles to go, but thank you for everything." Her smile was small, a rare crack in her guarded exterior. "Keep showing up. That's how it happens." As she turned away, Ethan felt a weight settle, not an end, but a milestone. He understood now. Accountability wasn't just about owning his mistakes, but carrying their consequences forward, shaping something better from the ashes. That night, he returned to the community center, drawn once more to the mural. A new edition gleamed under the streetlights, figures with hands linked, the words "strength through unity" arching above. He stood there, the cool air brushing his skin, and let the message sink deep. For the first time in years, purpose stirred within him, not the hollow rush of power, but the steady pulse of connection, of responsibility. This wasn't just Ethan's story, or Elias. It was a tapestry woven from choices, from the courage to face ugly truths, and the systems that propped them up. It was a lesson in justice, stark and unyielding. Power, when abused, leaves scars, but owning those scars can spark change. Not swift or painless, but real, built through relentless effort, through showing up when it's hardest. The past can't be undone, but the future, that's a canvas still taking shape, stroke by painstaking stroke. Ethan's chest felt like it was about to burst. his heart hammering so fiercely he could hear its frantic rhythm echoing in his ears. The room had fallen into a hushed stillness, every pair of eyes trained on him, waiting. He rose slowly from his seat, his legs trembling beneath him as though they might betray him at any moment. His voice quivered when he finally spoke, hesitant yet laced with a quiet resolve that surprised even himself. "We don't really know how to put this into words," he began, his throat tightening as he forced the confession forward. "But I feel like I have to say something. I need to." His gaze darted nervously round the room, locking briefly with the stares of those who had every reason to despise him, people whose lives he'd scarred with his arrogance, his recklessness, his misuse of power. Their faces were a gallery of guarded expressions, some etched with suspicion, others with faint traces of curiosity. "I've messed up," he admitted, his voice cracking under the weight of his own honesty. "More times than I can even count. I've hurt people right here in this room, people out there in this community. I can't take back what I've done, no matter how much I wish I could. But I want to own it. I want to face it. And more than anything, I want to figure out how to be better, how to do better." The silence that followed his words was thick, pressing down on him like a heavy fog. But it wasn't the hostile quiet he'd braced himself for. Instead, it felt deliberate, thoughtful, as if the room itself was holding its breath, weighing his sincerity against the wounds he'd inflicted. One by one, voices began to rise from the crowd. Not to forgive him, no. That wasn't what this was about, but to lay bare their truths. A young man with tired eyes spoke of the fear that had gripped him every time Ethan's patrol car rolled through his neighborhood, the way his stomach knotted at the sight of flashing lights. A woman, her voice trembling with restrained fury, recounted the humiliation she'd endured at his hands, the sting of being dismissed as less than human. Another shared the sleepless nights, the gnawing pain of betrayal from someone sworn to protect them. They didn't soften their stories or spare his feelings, and Ethan didn't want them to. He stood there, rooted to the spot, absorbing every syllable like a man caught in a storm with nowhere to hide. Each word carved itself into him, filling the hollow spaces where he'd once stashed excuses and self-righteous defenses. When the meeting drew to a close, the air still buzzed with the raw energy of their exchanges. An older woman approached him, her steps slow but deliberate, her face a map of hard-earned lines and wary eyes. She didn't smile, but there was no malice in her expression, either just a cautious openness that caught him off guard. "You've got a long road ahead of you, son," she said, her voice steady as stone, yet tinged with a faint warmth, like embers buried beneath ash. "But showing up here like this, facing all these folks, that's something. It's a start." Ethan's throat constricted, emotion swelling until it nearly choked him. "Thank you," he managed to whisper, the words barely audible as they slipped past the lump in his chest. Her nod was curt but meaningful, and as she turned away, he felt the flicker of something he hadn't dared to hope for a chance. In the weeks that followed, Ethan threw himself into the community not as some self-appointed hero seeking absolution, but as a man humbled, desperate to listen and learn. He volunteered at the local food bank, his hands trembling as he handed out bags to faces he vaguely recognized from his past misjudgments. He showed up to town hall meetings, sitting in the back with his head bowed, scribbling notes as residents debated issues he'd once ignored. He joined cleanup crews, hauling trash bags alongside people he'd once viewed through the narrow lens of his badge. Every interaction was a test, a mirror reflecting the damage he'd caused, a reminder of the trust he'd shattered, and the mountain of effort it would take to mend even a fraction of it. Yet amidst the struggle, he saw something else, the unyielding strength of those around him. People who could have cast him out, but instead chose to hold him to account in ways that cut deep, yet offered a strange kind of healing. Leia watched him from a distance, her sharp eyes tracking his every move, not out of duty, but a cautious intrigue that gnawed at her. She'd spent months investigating him, peeling back the layers of his abuses of power, and she'd expected him to crumble under the scrutiny. But here he was, still standing, his shoulders no longer squared with arrogance, but softened by a quiet humility. She noticed how he lingered after events, asking questions instead of barking orders, how his once brash voice had mellowed into something tentative yet earnest. The community's response wasn't warm or welcoming, not yet, but there was a shift, A gruff shopkeeper who'd once spat at the mention of Ethan's name now nodded curtly when he passed. A teenage girl who'd glared at him with venom weeks ago now met his gaze with a flicker of indifference. It wasn't forgiveness, it was acknowledgement. He was trying, and for Leia, that gritty, imperfect effort held more weight than any polished redemption tale. One evening, as the sun dipped below the skyline, casting the city in a wash of amber and shadow, Ethan found himself outside the community center. His eyes traced the mural splashed across its weathered bricks, a vivid explosion of color, depicting hands clasped in solidarity, faces alight with resilience. It stood in stark contrast to the divisions he'd once fueled, a silent rebuke to the man he'd been. He reached out, his fingertips grazing the rough surface, and a spark of hope flared within him, not for a quick fix or a fairy tale ending, but for the slow, messy possibility of transformation. Months later, his life bore little resemblance to the one he'd known. The badge that had once defined him lay forgotten in a drawer, replaced by the daily choices he made to rebuild. The community center had become his refuge, a place where he worked in quiet tandem with people he'd once distrusted, sweeping floors, stacking chairs, sharing coffee in companionable silence. His efforts didn't erase the past, nor did they win him instant acceptance. Forgiveness, he'd come to realize, wasn't a prize to be claimed, that it was a fragile, precious thing, earned through dogged persistence and unflinching accountability. The lesson sank deep. Justice wasn't just about punishment. It was about facing the consequences of your actions and choosing to grow from them, no matter how grueling the process. One day, he found himself in the packed auditorium of the annual community summit, an event he'd once scoffed at but now revered. He hadn't come to speak, just to listen, to soak in the stories of struggle and triumph that filled the room. But when the facilitator opened the floor and a voice shouted his name from the back, the air grew still, every head swiveled toward him, their eyes a mix of curiosity and doubt. His pulse roared as he stood, the microphone trembling slightly in his grip. "I don't have anything rehearsed," he said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "I didn't come here expecting to say anything, but if there's one thing I've learned, it's that sometimes you've got to show up even when it's hard, even when you're scared." He paused, his gaze sweeping the sea of faces, some familiar, some strangers. "I've done things I'm ashamed of. I've hurt people, made snap judgments, acted like I was above the rules I claimed to uphold. I'm sorry for that. I know words don't undo the pain, but I hope my actions can prove I'm serious about making it right, not for applause or a clean slate, but because it's what's owed." The silence that followed was heavy, charged with the echoes of his confession. He handed the mic back and sank into his seat, his heart still thudding. The applause, when it came, was soft but real, a murmur of recognition that he was in it for the long haul. For Leia, the months after her investigation had been a whirlwind of progress and frustration. Ethan's case had ignited a firestorm, sparking debates about accountability in law enforcement that led to new police mandatory bias, training, stricter oversight. It wasn't a cure, but it was a step, a crack in the armor of a flawed system. Late one night, alone in her office, she leaned back in her chair, reports strewn across her desk. Her mind wandered to Ethanto, the man he'd been and the one he was becoming. She thought of the countless others whose stories ended in silence, their voices snuffed out by the same abuses of power she'd spent her career fighting. It fueled her, that ache of injustice, a reminder of why she kept going. Their paths crossed again at a community event, an unplanned collision beneath the hum of laughter and music. When their eyes met across the crowded room, the air didn't crackle with tension as it once had. It shimmered with a quiet respect. They gravitated toward each other, steps tentative but sure. Leia spoke first, her voice even but laced with sincerity. "You've come a long way, Ethan." He nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Still got a ways to go, though. Thanks for everything." Her expression softened, a rare crack in her guarded demeanor. "Keep showing up. That's how it happens, real change." He felt her words settle into him, solid as stone. And as she walked away, a sense of closure washed over him, not an ending, but a clarity. He understood now what accountability truly meant, owning not just what he'd done, but the ripples it had sent through others' lives. That night, He returned to the community center, drawn once more to the mural. A new addition caught his eye, figures standing shoulder to shoulder, hands linked. The words "strength through unity" arching overhead in bold strokes. He stared at it, the message burrowing into him. For the first time in years, he felt anchored not by authority or control, but by the fragile, vital threads of connection and responsibility. This wasn't just Ethan's story, or lies. It was a tapestry woven from the choices we make, the systems we prop up or tear down, the courage it takes to face the ugly truths we'd rather bury. Change didn't come in a flash. It was forged in the slow burn of effort, the sting of consequence, the humility of listening. Justice, he'd learned, wasn't a gavel strike. It was a life rebuilt, one painstaking step at a time. And in that, there was power, not the kind he'd once wielded, but the kind that endured. The room fell into a hushed stillness, the kind that presses against your ears and makes every breath feel deliberate. Ethan stood at the front, his heart hammering so fiercely he could feel it reverberating through his ribs, a wild drumbeat urging him to either flee or fight. He chose neither. Instead, he straightened his spine, though his hands trembled faintly at his sides, and let his gaze sweep across the faces before him, faces etched with suspicion, hurt, and a quiet, simmering anger he knew he'd helped ignite. His voice faltered, a fragile thread of sound that threatened to snap under the weight of the moment. He swallowed hard, the lump in his throat sharp and unyielding, then pressed on. I don't really know how to start this, how to put it all into words, but I feel this need to say something, to be here. His eyes locked with theirs, one by one, each connection a silent plea for them to hear him out, even if they had every reason to turn away. He took a shaky breath, the air thick with the unspoken history between them. I've messed up, he admitted, the confession spilling out like stones tumbling down a cliffside. More times than I can count, more ways than I can excuse. I've hurt people, some of you sitting right here, others out there in this community I was supposed to protect. I can't go back and erase it, can't rewind the clock and undo the damage, but I can own it. I want to take responsibility, not just with words, but with everything I've got left. I want to figure out how to be better, how to do better, because I owe you that much. His voice cracked at the edges, raw and unguarded, as he stood there, stripped of the bravado that had once been his shield. The silence that followed wasn't sharp or accusing. It was heavy, thoughtful, a collective exhale that carried the weight of his words and the tangled emotions they stirred. Ethan braced himself, expecting rejection, braced for the bitterness he knew he deserved. But then, slowly, like the first drops of rain after a long drought, voices began to rise, not to forgive him, not to wipe the slate clean, but to lay bare their truths. A man in the back, his shoulders hunched from years of carrying unspoken burdens, spoke of the fear that had gripped him when Ethan's actions had cast shadows over his life. A young woman, her eyes fierce and unyielding, recounted the anger that had burned in her chest, the betrayal she'd felt from someone who'd worn a badge meant to stand for safety. Their stories weren't softened or polished, they were jagged, real, cutting deep into the spaces Ethan had once filled with flimsy excuses and hollow justifications. He didn't flinch. He listened, every word sinking into him like a stone into still water, rippling outward, forcing him to feel the full scope of what he'd done. When the meeting drew to a close, the air still buzzed with the echoes of those shared truths. Ethan lingered near the door, his chest tight, his mind a whirlwind of regret and resolve. An older woman approached him then, her steps slow but deliberate, her face a map of hard-earned lines and wary eyes that didn't quite soften, but didn't harden either. She stopped in front of him, her presence steady, grounding. "You've got a steep road ahead, son," she said, her voice firm yet threaded with a quiet weariness, as if she'd seen too many promises break against the rocks of reality. "But showing up here, facing this, it's something. It's a start." Ethan nodded, his throat constricting as emotion welled up, threatening to spill over. "Thank you," he managed, the words barely audible, a whisper carried on a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. She gave him a long, measuring look before turning away, leaving him with the faint flicker of possibility she'd planted in his chest. Weeks bled into months, and Ethan threw himself into the community not as some self-appointed hero seeking absolution. nor as a broken man begging for pity, but as someone finally willing to listen. To see, he volunteered at the local food bank, his hands sorting cans and packing boxes alongside people he'd once dismissed with a glance. He showed up to neighborhood events, standing awkwardly at the edges until someone pulled him into a conversationally a hard one, filled with questions he couldn't dodge and truths he couldn't deny. Each day was a mirror held up to his past, reflecting the harm he'd caused in stark, unflinching detail, but it also showed him something else, the quiet strength of those around him, their resilience shining through the cracks he'd helped create. They didn't welcome him with open arms, but they didn't shut him out either. Instead, they held him accountable, their scrutiny a painful but necessary balm, teaching him that justice wasn't a gavel's bang, but a slow, steady reckoning. Leia watched from a distance, her sharp eyes tracking his every move, not because she had to, but because she couldn't quite let go of the curiosity that tugged at her. She'd known Ethan when he'd strutted through life with an arrogance that made her stomach turn, his badge a crown he wore too proudly. Now she saw something different, the way he carried himself, shoulders less rigid, head bowed not in defeat but in humility. She noticed how the community responded with warmth, not yet, but with a grudging nod that he was putting in the work. It wasn't a fairy tale ending, no triumphant music swelling in the background, but it was honest. And for Leia, who'd spent years fighting for scraps of truth in a world that often buried them, that honesty was enough to keep her watching, waiting, wondering. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the city in hues of amber and shadow, Ethan found himself outside the community center. He stood there, hands in his pockets, staring at the mural that sprawled across the brick wall, a vivid tapestry of colors and figures. Hands clasped, faces lifted, a celebration of unity and strength that stood in stark contrast to the divisions he'd once deepened. He reached out, his fingertips grazing the rough, painted surface, and felt a spark ignite within him, not a blazing fire of certainty, but a small, fragile ember of hope. Hope not for a quick fix or a clean slate, but for the chance to keep going, to keep changing. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves at his feet, and he closed his eyes, letting the moment settle into his bones. Months later, Ethan's life bore little resemblance to the one he'd once known. The badge that had defined him, the mistakes that had chained him, they were no longer his identity. Now he was shaped by the choices he made each day, choices to show up, to rebuild. The community center had become his anchor, a second home where he worked quietly alongside people he'd once viewed through a lens of suspicion, people like Maria, who laughed too loud and always smelled of cinnamon, or Jamal, whose quick wit masked a grief Ethan was only beginning to understand. His efforts didn't erase the past, and they didn't win him instant trust. Forgiveness, he'd learned, wasn't a prize to be claimed but a gift earned through time, through showing up even when it hurt. Still, there were moments, a nod from Jamal as they hauled tables together, a half smile from Maria when he remembered her coffee order. Small, fleeting signs that he was being seen, not just as the man he'd been, but as the one he was trying to become. One day, the community summit rolled around, an event Ethan had once scoffed at, dismissing it as noise and wasted time. Now, he sat in the packed auditorium, the hum of voices filling the space as he took it all in. He wasn't there to speak, hadn't planned to draw attention. He just wanted to listen, to soak up the stories and lessons swirling around him. But then, as the facilitator opened the floor, a voice cut through the crowd. Ethan. And the room stilled, every head swiveling toward him. His heart lurched, pounding anew, but he rose when the mic was offered, his legs unsteady as he made his way forward. Standing there, the weight of their gazes pressed down on him, some skeptical, some curious, all waiting. He cleared his throat, the sound rough in the silence. "I didn't come with a speech," he said, his voice steadying as he found his footing. "I didn't expect to be up here. But if there's one thing I've figured out, it's that showing up matters, especially when it's hard, when you're scared of what people might say or think." He paused, his eyes sweeping the room, meeting theirs without flinching. "I've done things I'm ashamed of. I've hurt people, made choices that went against everything I told myself I believed in. I assumed things, acted out of ignorance or pride, and I was wrong. I'm sorry for all of it. I know words don't fix the past, but I hope my actions can show you I'm serious about doing better. Not for applause or some big redemption story, but because it's what's right." He handed the mic back, his pulse still racing, and sank into his seat. The applause that followed was soft, restrained, but real a quiet recognition that he was trying. And for Ethan, that was enough. For Leah, the months since Ethan's reckoning had been a storm of progress and frustration. His case had cracked open a wider dialogue about accountability, pushing the city to roll out new policies and training to tackle the biases festering in its systems. It wasn't a cure, just a step, and she knew the road ahead was long and uneven. Late one night, alone in her office with stacks of reports scattered across her desk, she paused, her pen hovering over a page. She thought of Ethan at the brash cop he'd been, but the man he was becoming. She thought of the countless others whose stories ended in silence, never getting the chance to shift. It fueled her, that ache for justice, that refusal to let the fight die. Weeks later, at a bustling community event, she and Ethan crossed paths again. It wasn't planned, just a moment where their eyes met across the crowd, a silent thread pulling them together. They walked toward each other, the air between them no longer thick with tension, but humming with something new, respect. Hard-won and fragile, Leah spoke first, her voice even, but warm. "You've come a long way, Ethan." He nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Still got a ways to go, but thank you for everything." She returned the smile, small but genuine, her guarded edges softening just enough. "Keep showing up," she said. "That's how it happens, change." He nodded again, her words sinking deep, and as she walked away, he felt a quiet closure, not an end, but a beginning, a clearer understanding of what accountability truly meant. That night, Ethan returned to the community center, drawn once more to the mural. It had grown since he'd last stood there, new scene added, people standing shoulder to shoulder, hands linked, the words "strength through unity" arching overhead in bold, sweeping strokes. He stared at it, the colors vivid even in the dim streetlight, and let the message seep into him. For the first time in years, he felt a purpose in it, one born of power or control, but of connection, of owning his part in the world around him. This isn't just Ethan's story, or lias it as a tapestry woven from the choices we all face, the systems we navigate, the courage it takes to stare down our own flaws. It's a lesson in justice, in the slow, grinding work of making things right, and in the consequences of wielding power without care. Change doesn't burst forth in a single, shining moment. It's carved out day by day, through effort that stings and heals in equal measure. We can't rewrite what's behind us, but we can build what's ahead, step by step, if we're willing to show up and do the work. Ethan learned that. Leah lived it. And maybe, just maybe, there's something in it for the rest of us too. Ethan's chest felt like a drum, each heartbeat reverberating through his ribs as the murmurs in the room faded to a tense hush. He rose slowly from his chair, his legs unsteady beneath him, as if they might buckle under the weight of what he was about to say. His throat tightened, his voice catching on the edges of uncertainty. Yet there was a fire flickering in his Gouda, stubborn resolve pushing him forward. I don't really know how to put this into words," he began, his tone wavering but resolute. "But I feel like I have to try." His eyes darted across the room, meeting the gazes of those seated around him, people whose faces bore the scars of his past actions, their expressions a mix of guarded curiosity and justified resentment. These were the men and women he'd wronged, the community he'd fractured with his arrogance and misjudgments. "I've messed up," he continued, his voice growing steadier as he forced himself to confront the truth aloud. "More times than I can count. I've hurt people, some of you sitting here, others beyond these walls. I've let you down. Let this whole town down." He paused, swallowing hard, the lump in his throat refusing to dissolve. "I can't erase what I've done, no matter how much I wish I could. But I'm here because I want to own it. I want to figure out how to be better, how to do better." The silence that followed pressed down on him like a physical force, thick and suffocating. Yet it wasn't laced with venom. Instead, it carried a contemplative weight, as if the room itself were holding its breath, digesting his confession, measuring the sincerity behind his trembling words. One by one, voices broke through the stillness, tentative at first, then swelling with raw honesty. A middle-aged man with weathered hands leaned forward, his brows furrowed as he recounted the nights he'd lain awake, gripped by fear Ethan's actions had sown. A young woman, her voice sharp with lingering anger, described the sting of betrayal she'd felt when Ethan, once a figure of authority, had turned that power against her. They didn't soften their words or spare his feelings, and Ethan didn't want them to. He stood there, hands clasped tightly in front of him, absorbing every syllable like a man standing in the rain, letting it soak through him. Cold and unrelenting, filling the hollow spaces where excuses once thrived. His jaw clenched as their stories washed over him, each one a mirror reflecting the damage he'd inflicted, each one a lesson in the cost of wielding power without care. When the meeting drew to a close, the air in the room felt differentless brittle, though far from warm. An older woman approached him as the crowd thinned, her gray hair pulled back in a tight bun. Her eyes narrowed with a wariness that spoke of years spent guarding her trust. She stopped a few feet away, her posture straight, but her hands trembling slightly at her sides. "You've got a long road ahead, son," she said, her voice firm yet threaded with something softer, something almost maternal. "Showing up here, laying yourself bare like this, it's a start. Not a finish line, but a start." Ethan's throat constricted again, emotion surging up so fiercely he could barely choke out a response. "Thank you," he whispered, the words fragile, barely audible over the shuffle of departing footsteps. She gave him a curt nod before turning away, leaving him standing there, grappling with the flicker of hope her words had ignited. In the weeks that followed, Ethan threw himself into the life of the community not as some grand redeemer seeking applause, but as a man humbled, learning to listen where he'd once only spoken. He volunteered at the local food bank, his sleeves rolled up as he stacked cans beside people he'd once dismissed with a glance. He showed up to town events, lingering on the edges of conversations that grew quieter when he approached, feeling the sting of their suspicion but pressing on anyway. Every interaction was a tightrope walk, a reminder of the wounds he'd carved into this place. Yet amid the struggle, he saw glimmers of something else: resilience in the faces of those who'd suffered, strength in their willingness to let him stand among them, not as a forgiven man, but as one held to account. It was a painful kind of grace, sharp-edged and hard-won, teaching him that justice wasn't about erasure, but about facing the consequences head-on. Leia watched him from a distance, her notepad tucked under her arm as she jotted observations in the margins of her reports. She wasn't there to coddle him or track his every move out of duty. She was driven by a quiet, cautious intrigue. She noticed the shift in how he carried himself. The squared shoulders of his old bravado had softened, replaced by a posture that seemed to bow slightly under the weight of his past. She saw it in the way he lingered after meetings, asking questions instead of barking orders, and in the way the community responded not with embraces or cheers, but with a reluctant nod, a murmured "he's trying." It wasn't a fairy tale ending, no triumphant music swelling in the background. It was messy, real, and for Leia, that rawness held more value than any polished redemption story. One evening, as the sun dipped low, casting the city in hues of amber and shadow, Ethan found himself outside the community center. His gaze settled on the mural splashed across its brick facade, a vivid tapestry of bold colors and intertwined figures, hands clasped in a symbol of unity and defiance. It stood in stark contrast to the divisions he'd once fueled, a silent rebuke to the man he'd been. He reached out, his fingertips grazing the rough, painted surface, and for a moment, he felt something steer a fragile thread of hope, not for a quick fix or a clean slate, but for the slow, arduous possibility of change. The coolness of the bricks grounded him, tethering him to this place and its people, whispering that perhaps he could belong here, not as a ruler, but as a participant. Months rolled by, and the contours of Ethan's life reshaped themselves entirely. The badge that once defined him, shiny and authoritative and sat forgotten in a drawer, replaced by the quiet rhythm of days spent rebuilding what he'd broken. The community center became his refuge, its creaky floors and chipped paint a second home where he worked alongside men and women he'd once eyed with distrust. He hauled lumber for repairs, swept the steps, shared coffee with volunteer, small acts that didn't erase his past. but wove him into the fabric of their present. His efforts didn't win him instant praise. Forgiveness, he'd come to realize, wasn't a prize to be claimed with a few good deeds. It was a gift, rare and unowed, earned through the steady drip of time and trust. One crisp afternoon, Ethan sat in the packed auditorium of the annual community summit, a gathering he'd once scoffed at as pointless. Now, its significance hummed through him, a pulse of connection he'd been too blind to see before. He hadn't come to take the stage or bask in attention. He was there to listen, to soak in the voices of those who'd rebuilt what he'd torn apart. But as the facilitator opened the floor, a voice rang out from the back, sharp and clear, "Ethan." The room stilled, every head swiveling toward him, their eyes a mix of expectation and doubt. His pulse quickened, hammering against his ribs as he stood, the microphone thrust into his hands like a live wire. He cleared his throat, the sound echoing in the cavernous space. "I don't have anything rehearsed," he said, his voice low but firm, carrying the tremor of vulnerability. "I didn't come here planning to talk, but if there's one thing I've learned, it's that showing up matters even when it's hard, even when you're scared of what people might say." He scanned the crowd, meeting their stares, feeling the weight of their judgment and the faint flicker of their curiosity. "I've done things I regretted, people, made snap decisions, acted like I was above the rules I claimed to uphold. I'm sorry for that. Words don't undo the damage, I know that. But I'm here to show you day by day that I'm trying to make it right, not for a pat on the back, but because it's what's owed." The silence that followed was heavy, a collective breath held as his words settled. He handed the mic back, his hands trembling slightly, and sank into his seat, heart still thudding. The applause, when it came, was soft, not a roaring ovation, but a genuine ripple of sound, a quiet nod to his effort. For Ethan, it was a lifeline, a whisper that he was on the right path. For Leia, watching from the sidelines, it was a piece of a larger puzzle. The months since Ethan's reckoning had been a storm of progress, and Pushbacky's case sparking debates that rippled beyond their town, birthing new policies to curb the abuses he'd once embodied. It wasn't a fix, but a beginning, and as she stood in her office late one night, poring over reports under the dim glow of a desk lamp, she let herself reflect. Ethan's journey was one thread in a tapestry of countless others, who'd never get the chance to change, others still fighting in the shadows. It fueled her, a reminder of why she kept digging, kept pushing. Their paths crossed again weeks later at a community event, an unplanned collision under the strung lights of a bustling courtyard. When their eyes met across the crowd, there was no fanfare, just a quiet recognition, a bridge built from mutual respect rather than obligation. Leia approached first, her steps measured, her voice even but warm. "You've come a long way, Ethan," she said, her words carrying the weight of observation rather than flattery. He nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips, humility softening his features. "Still got a ways to go," he replied, steady but sincere. "Thank you for everything," she returned, a small smile, her guarded edges easing just enough to let him see her belief in him. "Keep showing up," she said simply. "That's how it happens." As she walked away, Ethan felt a quiet settling in his chest, not an end, but a milestone, a realization that accountability wasn't just about owning his mistakes, but about carrying their impact forward. That night, he returned to the community center, drawn once more to the mural. It had grown since he'd last stood her, a new scene painted in, figures standing shoulder to shoulder, hands linked, the words "strength through unity" arching overhead in bold strokes. He stared at it, the colors blurring as his eyes traced the lines, the message sinking deep into his bones. For the first time in years, he felt anchored not by the power he'd once chased, but by the ties he was forging, fragile but real. This wasn't just Ethan's story, or lies, it was a testament to the choices we wrestle with, the systems we prop up or tear down, the courage it takes to face the mirror of our flaws. Change doesn't burst forth in a single, glorious moment. It's carved out through the slow grind of effort, often laced with pain. It's about knowing the past can't be unwritten, but the future can be shaped by showing up, by listening, by doing the work, no matter how heavy the load. Isaiah Carr ran his hand gently along the dashboard of his gleaming new Lexus, brushing away a tiny speck of dust that dared to settle on its pristine surface. The car was barely a week old, yet it already held a special place in his heart, a treasure he cherished deeply. The leather seats still shimmered with that fresh-from-the-factory glow, their scent filling the air with a subtle promise of luxury. As the engine hummed softly beneath him, a wave of satisfaction washed over him, a feeling so vivid he could almost reach out and touch it. He had just left the courthouse where the day had been a relentless storm of hearings, endless stacks of paperwork, and the heavy burden of other people's troubles pressing down on his shoulders. Now, driving through the tree-lined streets of Winterdale, Michigan, he felt the tension begin to unravel. The grand homes, with their sprawling lawns and elegant facades, stood like silent sentinels along the road, offering a stark contrast to the chaos he left behind. This drive was his sanctuary, a fleeting moment where he could breathe, reclaim control, and let the world fade into the background. The jazz pouring from the radio wrapped around him like a warm embrace, its smooth rhythm coaxing a quiet hum from his lips. For a brief second, he felt at peace, the weight of the day slipping away. But that serenity shattered as flashes of red and blue pierced the twilight, slicing through the calm like a jagged blade. His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, and there it was, a police cruiser trailing him, its lights insistent and unyielding. His heart stuttered in his chest, a sudden jolt of unease tightening his grip on the steering wheel. He eased the car to the side of the road, his movements deliberate, though his mind churned with confusion. Winterdale was a quiet haven, far removed from the clamor of city streets, and he hadn't been speeding, quite the opposite. In fact, he'd been savoring the slow, leisurely drive home after a grueling week. So why was this happening? What could he possibly have done to draw this unwanted attention? A sharp rap on the window jolted him from his thoughts. He turned to see a towering figure looming outside, a broad-shouldered officer, with an expression carved from stone. Her hand rested near her holstered gun, a silent warning that set his nerves on edge. "License and registration," she snapped, her voice cutting through the air with no hint of warmth or courtesy. Isaiah nodded silently, his fingers trembling slightly as he reached into the glove compartment. He handed over the documents, watching as she officer RH's, according to her nameplate, snatched them from his grasp without even a glance in his direction. Her eyes narrowed as they darted between the papers and his face, her scrutiny intense and unrelenting. "Step out of the car," she commanded, her tone clipped and cold. Isaiah blinked, caught off guard. "Excuse me," he said, his voice steady but laced with disbelief. "Out, now," she repeated, her words harder this time, leaving no room for debate. For a moment, he hesitated, his mind racing to make sense of the absurdity unfolding before him. He wasn't just some random driver who was Judge Isaiah Carr, a man who had spent years earning respect in these very streets. He had presided over countless cases in the courthouse, some likely involving officers his own precinct. Winterdale was his home, a place where his name carried weight, where people greeted him with nods of recognition. Yet here he stood, stripped of that dignity, treated like a common criminal. "Ma'am, there must be some misunderstanding," he said, forcing his voice to remain even despite the storm brewing inside him. "I'm Judge Isaiah Carr. This is my car, and I live just a few blocks from here." Officers raised an eyebrow, her hand inching closer to her gun. "Step out." "Now," she repeated, her gaze unflinching, swallowing the bitter surge of frustration rising in his throat. Isaiah pushed open the door and stepped onto the pavement, the cool evening air brushing against his skin as he faced her. She circled him slowly, her boots clicking against the asphalt, her eyes raking over him as though he were prey she was sizing up. "I've had reports of a vehicle like this stolen last week," she said, her voice flat but her stare piercing, daring him to crack under its weight. Isaiah's jaw tightened, a flicker of anger sparking in his chest. "This is my car," he replied, his tone firm but controlled. "I bought it from the dealership a few days ago. If you run the plates, you'll see it's clean." She didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge his words. Instead, she stepped closer, her presence imposing. "Hands on the hood," she barked, her hand hovering near her weapon. "This is unnecessary," he protested, his patience fraying like a thread pulled too tight. "I've done nothing wrong." Her eyes glinted with something dark, suspicion, perhaps, or something more menacing. "You'll do as I say, or we'll have a problem," she shot back, her voice a steel blade slicing through the air. Isaiah's blood boiled, a rush of heat flooding his veins, but he forced himself to stay calm. He wasn't just anyone who knew the law inside and out, understood his rights better than most. Yet in this moment, all his achievements, all the years spent building a life of integrity, felt like dust slipping through his fingers. With a deep, steadying breath, he placed his hands on the warm hood of his Lexus, the metal smooth beneath his palms. He could feel eyes boring into him, not just hers, but those of the neighbors. Curtains twitched in the windows of the stately homes lining the street, shadowy figures peering out to witness his disgrace. The sting of humiliation burned hotter than any anger, searing into his soul. He had clawed his way up from nothing to stand as a pillar of this community, only to be reduced to this, a spectacle for gossiping onlookers. Officer stepped forward, her hands rough and unapologetic as she patted him down, her movements brusque and devoid of respect. "We've had reports of car thefts in the area," she said, her tone matter of fact, as though that justified her actions. "This vehicle matches the description of one stolen last week." Isaiah's teeth clenched so hard his jaw ached. "I already told you. I bought this car days ago. If you'd let me explain, save it for the station." She cut him off, reaching for her handcuffs with a casualness that made his stomach twist. His heart pounded, a frantic rhythm against his ribs, but he forced his voice to remain steady. "Officer RH's, I suggest you call your superior before you make a decision you'll regret." Her hand froze above the cuffs, her eyes narrowing as she studied him. "You expect me to believe that?" she scoffed, her skepticism dripping like venom. "I expect you to verify my identity and do your job properly," he replied, meeting her gaze without flinching. For the first time, a shadow of doubt flickered across her face, her unshakable confidence wavering. With a frustrated huff, she stepped back and grabbed her radio, muttering into it while keeping him pinned under her watchful stare. The minutes that followed stretched into an agonizing eternity. Isaiah stood there, hands still pressed against the car, the cool evening breeze doing little to soothe the fire raging inside him. Officer shifted her weight from one foot to the other, her eyes darting between him and the radio, waiting for a response. The tension between them crackled like static, thick and suffocating. He couldn't shake the weight of those unseen nice neighbors, still watching, whispering behind their curtains, turning his shame into their evening entertainment. Finally, the radio hissed to life, a voice cutting through the silence. "RH's, stand down immediately. Judge Carr is a respected member of the community." "I'm on my way." Isaiah straightened, a flood of relief coursing through him, though it couldn't erase the bitter taste of what had just happened. His dignity lay in tatters, shredded by this baseless confrontation, and no apology could stitch it back together. Officer's face flushed a deep crimson, her bravado crumbling as she lowered the radio. She hesitated, her lips parting as though searching for words, then muttered, "I'm sorry, Your Honor. There seems to have been a misunderstanding." Isaiah adjusted his jacket, his movements deliberate, his composure a fragile mask over the anger still simmering beneath. "A misunderstanding," he echoed, his voice low but sharp enough to cut. "That's what we're calling racial profiling now, officer." Before she could muster a response, another police car rolled up, its tires crunching against the gravel. A tall man with graying hair stepped out, Captain Reynolds, head of the Winterdale precinct. His strides were quick, purposeful, his face etched with a mixture of concern and urgency as he approached. "Judge Carr," he called out, his voice heavy with regret. "I can't begin to apologize enough for this. Rest assured, we'll get to the bottom of it." Isaiah nodded, but his mind was already spinning, racing beyond this moment. This wasn't just about him, it was about the countless others who didn't have a title to shield them, who faced this kind of injustice every day with no one to intervene. The weight of that realization settled over him like a mantle, heavy but resolute. "Captain," Isaiah said, his voice steady and commanding, cutting through the awkward silence, "I'd like to speak with you and Officer not as a victim, but as someone who believes we can turn this into something more, an opportunity for real change." Captain Reynolds paused, his eyes widening slightly as he registered the gravity of Isaiah's words. Officer RH shifted uncomfortably, her earlier arrogance replaced by a quiet unease. In that moment, Isaiah felt the spark of purpose ignite within him. This wasn't just a personal affront, it was a glaring reminder of the consequences of unchecked power, a lesson in justice that demanded more than apologies. It was a call to action, one he would answer not just for himself, but for those who had no voice to fight back. Isaiah Carr ran his fingers gently across the dashboard of his gleaming new Lexus, brushing away a tiny speck of dust that dared to settle on its pristine surface. The car was barely a week old, yet it had already become his sanctuary, a symbol of hard-earned success. The leather seats, still radiating that fresh-from-the-factory scent, hugged him as he sank into them, and the engine's soft, rhythmic hum wrapped around him like a warm blanket after a grueling day. He had just left the courthouse in Witterdale, Michigan, where the weight of endless hearings, towering stacks of paperwork, and the tangled lives of strangers had pressed heavily on his shoulders. Now, as he cruised down the wide, tree-lined streets, the grand homes with their manicured lawns stretching far from the road offered him a fleeting sense of peace. This drive was his ritual, a sacred pause where he could breathe, reclaim control, and let the tension of his role as a judge slip away, if only for a moment. The golden hues of the late afternoon sun filtered through the branches, casting dappled shadows across the windshield. Isaiah's lips curved into a faint smile as he began to hum along with the mellow jazz, spilling from the radio, its smooth notes weaving into the calm of the evening. But that tranquility shattered in an instant. A sudden flash of red and blue pierced the soft dusk, slicing through the quiet like a jagged blade. His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, and there it was, a police cruiser, its lights pulsing ominously behind him. His heart jolted, a quick, unsteady thud against his ribs, and his hands tightened around the steering wheel, the leather creaking faintly under his grip. He eased the car to the side of the road, his mind scrambling to make sense of it. He hadn't been speeding, quite the opposite. He'd been savoring the slow drive, deliberately keeping well under the limit after a week that had drained him to his core. The neighborhood around him was still, a hushed enclave far removed from the clamor of the city. So why was this happening? Before he could piece it together, a sharp rap on the window jolted him from his thoughts. He turned his head and found himself staring up at a towering figure, a police officer, her broad shoulders filling the frame of the glass. Her face was a blank mask, unreadable, but her hand hovered near the holster at her hip, a silent warning that set Isaiah's nerves on edge. "License and registration," she snapped, her voice cutting through the air without a hint of warmth or courtesy. Isaiah swallowed the confusion bubbling in his chest and nodded, keeping his movements slow and deliberate as he reached for the glove compartment. He handed over the documents, his fingers steady despite the unease coiling inside him. The officer, her nameplate glinting with the letters, RHS, snatched the papers from his grasp without so much as a glance in his direction. Her eyes flicked over them, narrowing as they darted between the pages and his face, scrutinizing him as though he were a puzzle she couldn't quite solve. "Step out of the car," she commanded, her tone abrupt and final. Isaiah blinked, caught off guard. "Excuse me," he said, his voice calm but laced with disbelief. "Out now," she barked again, the words sharper this time, leaving no room for debate. For a fleeting second, he hesitated, his mind racing to catch up. He was a judge, for heaven's sake, a man who had spent years commanding respect in courtrooms, presiding over cases that shaped lives. He knew this town, these streets, these people. He had likely reviewed cases involving this very officer's department. Yet here he stood, pinned under her gaze like a common criminal. "Ma'am, there must be some misunderstanding," he said, forcing his voice to remain even. "I'm Judge Isaiah Carr. This is my car, and I live just a few blocks from here." Officer RHS raised an eyebrow, her expression shifting ever so slightly. Skepticism, perhaps, or something darker. Her hand inched closer to her gun, a subtle but unmistakable threat. "Step out, now." The words landed like a gavel, heavy and unyielding. Isaiah's throat tightened, a surge of indignation rising like bile, but he swallowed it down. He wasn't foolish enough to escalate this, not here. Not with her finger twitching near that holster. With a slow, measured breath, he pushed the door open and stepped onto the pavement. the cool evening air brushing against his skin as he stood beside his car. Officer RHS circled him like a predator sizing up its prey, her boots clicking against the asphalt with deliberate precision. "I've had reports of a vehicle like this stolen last week," she said, her eyes boring into him as if expecting him to crumble and confess. Isaiah's jaw clenched, the muscles tightening painfully. "This is my car," he replied, his voice steady but edged with frustration. "I bought it from the dealership a few days ago. If you run the plates, you'll see it's clean." She didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge his words. Instead, she stepped closer, her presence looming. "Hands on the hood," she snapped, her tone brooking no argument. Isaiah's patience frayed, threads of anger unraveling inside him. "This is unnecessary," he protested, his voice rising just enough to betray the storm brewing beneath his calm exterior. "I've done nothing wrong." Her eyes glinted suspicion. "Yes, but something else too, something colder, more menacing. You're going to do as I say, or we'll have a problem," she said, her voice low and hard, each syllable dripping with authority. Heat surged through Isaiah's veins, his blood pounding in his ears, but he forced himself to stay grounded. He knew the law knew it better than most. He knew his rights, his standing, his reputation. And yet, in this moment, none of it seemed to matter. With a deep, shuddering breath, he placed his hands on the hood of his Lexus, the metal cool against his palms. He felt exposed, vulnerable, as if the very air around him carried the weight of unseen eyes. Sure enough, curtains twitched in the windows of the stately homes lining the street, neighbors peering out to witness the scene unfolding before them. The sting of humiliation cut deeper than anything else, deeper than the officer's brusque commands, deeper than the absurdity of the situation. He had spent his life climbing out of shadows, earning respect, building a name that meant something. Now he was reduced to this, a spectacle for the curious, a man stripped of dignity in the place he called home. Officer RHS began patting him down, her hands rough and unapologetic, her movements devoid of any trace of respect. "We've had reports of car thefts in the area," she said, her voice flat. "This vehicle matches the description of one stolen last week." Isaiah's teeth ground together, his frustration boiling over. "I already told ya we bought this car days ago. If you'd let me explain, save it for the station." She cut him off, reaching for her handcuffs. His heart slammed against his chest, a wild, frantic rhythm. But he forced his voice to remain steady. "Officer RHS, I suggest you call your superior before you make a mistake you'll regret." Her hand froze above the cuffs, her eyes locking onto his. "You expect me to believe that?" she scoffed, but there was a flicker in her gaze uncertainty. Perhaps, creeping through her armor of confidence. "I expect you to verify who I am and do your job properly," Isaiah replied, his stare unwavering, his voice a quiet blade of authority. For a moment, she faltered, her bravado cracking just enough to reveal the doubt beneath. With a huff, she stepped back and grabbed her radio, muttering into it while keeping him fixed in her sights. The minutes that followed stretched into an agonizing eternity. Isaiah stood there, hands still pressed against the car, the cold seeping into his fingers as the tension hung thick between them. Officer RHS shifted her weight, her eyes darting from him to the radio, waiting for a response. The neighborhood watched in silence, the air buzzing with the unspoken judgment of those hidden behind their curtains. Finally, the radio crackled to life, a voice cutting through the static. "RHS, stand down immediately. Judge Carr is a respected member of the community." "I'm on my way." Isaiah straightened, a wave of relief crashing over him, though it did little to wash away the bitterness clinging to his soul. Officer RHS's face flushed a deep crimson, her composure crumbling as she lowered the radio. She hesitated, then muttered, "I'm sorry, Your Honor. There seems to have been a misunderstanding." Isaiah adjusted his jacket, his movements deliberate, his dignity pieced back together though the cracks remained. "A misunderstanding," he echoed, his voice calm but laced with steel. "Is that what we're calling racial profiling now, officer?" Before she could muster a response, another police car rolled up, its tires crunching against the gravel. A tall man with graying hair stepped out. Captain Reynolds, head of the local precinct. He approached with urgency, his face etched with concern. "Judge Carr," he called, his voice carrying across the quiet street. "I can't apologize enough for this. We'll get to the bottom of it, I promise." Isaiah nodded, but his mind was already elsewhere, racing through the implications of what had just transpired. This wasn't just about him, it never had been. It was about the countless others who had faced the same indignity, who didn't have a title or a reputation to shield them. The weight of that realization settled into his bones, heavy and unyielding. "Captain," Isaiah said, his voice steady, resonant with purpose, "I'd like to speak with you and Officer RHS, not as a victim, but as someone who believes we can turn this into something more, an opportunity for real change." Reynolds paused, his eyes meeting Isaiah's, and in that moment, a spark of understanding passed between them. This wasn't the end of the story, it was the beginning. For Isaiah, it was a call to action, a vow to wield his authority not just for justice in the courtroom, but for justice in the streets where power, unchecked, could twist into something cruel. The lesson was clear. True authority came with responsibility, and the consequences of its abuse rippled far beyond a single moment, touching lives in ways that demanded accountability, reflection, and ultimately, transformation. "Close like this?" Isaiah nodded, sensing the shift in her perspective. "That's the point, Officer RHS. It's not just about enforcing the law, it's about understanding who it's enforced on and why. We're all part of the same machine, but too often, we don't see the damage it does until it's personal." RHS looked down at her hands, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her uniform sleeve. "I didn't mean to. I wasn't trying to humiliate you, Judge Carr. I thought I was doing the right thing." "I know," Isaiah said gently, "and that's why we're here now. Intentions matter, but outcomes matter more. You didn't see me that day, not really. You saw a stereotype, and I don't blame you for that entirely. It's what you've been taught, what the system reinforces. But we can unlearn it. We have to." She nodded slowly, her defenses softening. "What you said in that meeting about assumptions, hurting the community, it stuck with me. I've been thinking about it ever since." "Good," Isaiah replied. "That's where it starts. One thought, one conversation. It's not about guilt, it's about growth." The young man's case they just witnessed lingered in the air between them. Falsely accused, his life had nearly unraveled because of a single misidentification, assumption, that snowballed into handcuffs, a night in a cell, and a courtroom battle. Isaiah had dismissed the charges, but the damage was done. The boy's eyes, wide with a mix of relief and lingering fear, had mirrored Isaiah's own from that day on the quiet street. "Seeing it from this side," RHS continued, gesturing toward the bench, "it's not the same as being out there. We're trained to act fast, to trust our instincts. But what if those instincts are wrong? They often are," Isaiah said plainly, "not because you're a bad officer, but because they're shaped by a world that's already skewed. That's what I want us to fix, not just you, not just me, but all of us." RHS didn't respond immediately, but the silence wasn't hostile. It was thoughtful, heavy with the weight of realization. For the first time, Isaiah felt like she was truly listening not just to him, but to the bigger truth he'd been wrestling with since that traffic stop. Over the next few months, the ripples of that day began to spread. Isaiah's program gained traction, small but steady. Officers started attending workshops reluctantly, others with genuine curiosity. Community members joined too, sharing their stories, their fears, their hopes. It wasn't a revolution, not yet, but it was a beginning. Conversations were happening, assumptions were being questioned, and slowly, trust fragile and hard-won began to take root. Denise noticed the change in Isaiah too. One evening, as they sat together in their living room, she squeezed his hand. "You're doing it," she said softly. "You're turning that moment into something real." Isaiah smiled, though the weight still lingered in his chest. "It's not enough yet, but it's a start." "It's more than that," she countered. "You're showing them what justice can look like when it's not just a word on a page. You're showing them it's personal." He looked out the window again, at the same quiet street where it had all begun. The curtains were still drawn in some houses, but in others, they were open, noticeable signs of life, of connection. Little by little, the neighborhood was waking up, and so was he. Isaiah didn't know how far this journey would take him, or how much resistance he'd face along the way. But he knew one thing for certain: he wouldn't stop. Not until the system he'd spent his life serving could see him and everyone like him for who they truly were, not a threat, not a suspect, but a person, a judge, a voice. And maybe, just maybe, that spark from a single humiliating moment could grow into a fire big enough to light the way forward. Careful, Denise finished, her voice trembling slightly but resolute. Isaiah reached across the table and took her hand, squeezing it gently. "I promise," he said, meeting her gaze. "I'll be as careful as I can, but we can't let them win out when we're this close." The next few days were a blur of tension and clandestine meetings. Isaiah and Aaron worked tirelessly, piecing together fragments of evidence, bank statements showing suspicious transfers, emails between Apex Builders executives and police officials, and even a few grainy audio recordings Aaron had managed to pull from a compromised server. Each discovery painted a clearer picture of the corruption that had festered in Winterdale for years, a rot that had spread from the construction sites to the highest offices in town. Isaiah knew they couldn't rely solely on digital evidence. They needed something tangible, something undeniable. Late one evening, Aaron called with a lead. "I've got a guy," he said, his voice hushed over the phone, "a former Apex employee. He's got physical copies of contract zones that were never supposed to see the light of day. He's willing to talk, but he's scared, says he'll only meet with you." "Where?" Isaiah asked, already grabbing his coat. "Old warehouse on Miller Road, midnight. Come alone as jumpy." Isaiah hesitated. The idea of meeting a whistleblower in an abandoned warehouse in the dead of night didn't sit right, but they were running out of options. "All right," he said finally. "I'll be there. You stay on the records, keep digging." "Be careful, Isaiah," Aaron warned. "This feels like it could go sideways fast." "I know," Isaiah replied, ending the call. He glanced at Denise, who was watching him from the doorway, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. He didn't need to say anything she already knew. "Just come back," she said quietly. "I will," he promised, though the weight of uncertainty hung heavy in his voice. The warehouse on Miller Road was a hulking, rusted relic of Winterdale's industrial past, its windows shattered and its walls tagged with faded graffiti. Isaiah parked a block away and approached on foot, the crunch of gravel under his boots the only sound in the still night. The air was cold, his breath visible in faint clouds as he slipped through a broken side door. Inside, the space was cavernous and dark, lit only by the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the cracked roof. Isaiah's eyes adjusted slowly, scanning the shadows for movement. "Hello," he called softly, his voice echoing off the metal walls. A figure stepped out from behind a stack of rotting crotets, a weary man in his 40s, his face gaunt and unshaven. He clutched a thick manila envelope in trembling hands. "You Isaiah?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Yeah," Isaiah replied, keeping his distance. "You the guy Aaron sent me to meet?" The man nodded jerkily. "Name's Paul. Worked for Apex till I couldn't stomach it anymore. They've been cutting corners, bad materials, fake inspections. People got hurt. I kept records." He thrust the envelope forward. "This is everything. Contracts, payoffs, names. Take it and get out before." A sharp noise cut him off, a metallic clank from the far end of the warehouse. Isaiah's head snapped toward the sound, his pulse spiking. "What was that?" he whispered. Paul's eyes widened in panic. "They followed me," he stammered, backing away. "I knew it. They've been watching." Before Isaiah could respond, headlights flared through the broken windows, bathing the warehouse in blinding white. Tires screeched outside, and the sound of boots hitting the ground echoed through the walls. "Go," Paul hissed, shoving the envelope into Isaiah's hands before darting toward a side exit. Isaiah didn't hesitate. Clutching the envelope, he bolted for the shadows, weaving between crates as voices shouted behind him. "Find him. He's got the files." Someone barked too close for comfort. His heart pounded as he ducked behind a rusted forklift, peering out to see three figures moving through the warehouse, their silhouettes sharp against the headlights. One of them wore a police uniform. Isaiah's mind raced. He couldn't outrun them, not with the exits blocked. He needed a distraction. Spotting a loose metal pipe on the ground, he grabbed it and hurled it across the warehouse. It clattered loudly against a stack of barrels, drawing the pursuer's attention. "Over there." One shouted, and they pivoted, giving Isaiah a narrow window. He sprinted for the side door Paul had taken, bursting into the night air just as gunfire cracked behind him. A bullet whizzed past, splintering the doorframe inches from his head. Adrenaline surged as he dove behind a dumpster. The envelope still clutched tightly against his chest. He could hear them closing in, their footsteps heavy and deliberate. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Isaiah fumbled to answer, keeping his voice a harsh whisper. "They're here, warehouse. I've got the files, but they're shooting." "Get out now." Aaron's voice was frantic. "I'm 5 minutes away, hold on." Isaiah didn't have 5 minutes. Peering around the dumpster, he saw the uniformed figure barking orders, a flashlight beam sweeping dangerously close. He had one shot. The oak tree outside his house flashed in his minutes, branches swaying in the wind. If he could make it to the tree line, beyond the warehouse, he might lose them in the dark. Taking a deep breath, he broke from cover and ran, zigzagging as more shots rang out. The ground was uneven, his lungs burning, but he pushed forward, the envelope a lifeline in his grip. The trees loomed ahead, and he plunged into their cover, branches snagging at his coat as he disappeared into the shadows. Behind him, the shouts faded, replaced by the distant wail of Siren Saron's backup. He hoped. Isaiah didn't stop until he reached a ditch 100 yards in, collapsing against the muddy bank. Chest heaving, he tore open the envelope, his fingers shaking as he skimmed the contents under the faint light of his phone. Names, dates, dollar amounts, it was all there. Enough to bring Apex Builders and half the Winterdale PD crashing down. But as he caught his breath, one thought gnawed at him. They knew who he was now, and they wouldn't stop until they silenced him for good, and resolve settle over him. This was the moment they had been building toward the point of no return. The evidence they had painstakingly gathered was about to be laid bare, for the entire town of Winterdale to see, and there was no telling how the corrupt officials and Apex Builders would retaliate. But Isaiah knew one thing for certain: silence was no longer an option. The studio lights blazed to life, and Jeff Lawson straightened in his chair as the countdown began. 5, 4, 3. To the director's voice faded into the background as the red light on the camera blinked on. Jeff's calm, authoritative tone filled the room. "Good evening, Winterdale. This is Jeff Lawson with a special late-night report. Tonight, we bring you an urgent story that strikes at the heart of our community's story of corruption, betrayal, and bravery. With me are Judge Isaiah Carter and Detective Aaron Mills, who have uncovered evidence of systemic misconduct involving high-ranking members of our police department and city government, in collusion with Apex Builders." Jeff turned to Isaiah, his expression grave but composed. "Judge Carter, can you tell us what you've discovered?" Isaiah leaned forward, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "Over the past week, Detective Mills and I have uncovered a network of corruption that's been rotting Winterdale from the inside. Apex Builders has been paying off police officials to overlook safety violations and falsify reports. These actions have endangered workers, residents, and the very integrity of our tunnel to protect the company's profits. We have documents, emails, payment records, irrefutable proof that those entrusted to uphold the law have instead abused it." Aaron nodded beside him, holding up the folder for the camera. "Every name, every transaction, it's all here. This isn't speculation, it's fact, and it's time the people of Winterdale know the truth." Jeff took the folder, flipping it open to show the audience a glimpse of the damning evidence. "This is explosive material," he said, his voice carrying the weight of the moment. "What happens next? That's up to the people," Isaiah replied, his gaze unwavering. "We're putting this in the public's hands because those in power have failed us. Investigations need to happen, independent ones. The guilty need to face justice, no matter who they are." The broadcast continued for another 10 minutes, with Jeff asking pointed questions and Isaiah and Aaron laying out the timeline of their investigation. Lisa Chen stood off to the side, her arms crossed, watching the scene unfold with a mix of pride and apprehension. She knew the story would dominate headlines by morning, if not sooner. As the cameras cut and the studio lights dimmed, Jeff turned to Isaiah and Aaron. "You'd have just lit a match. I hope you're ready for the fire." "We don't have a choice," Aaron said, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. They were closing in on us. This was our only shot. Isaiah nodded, though the unease from earlier still gnawed at him. The men in dark suits. Aaron's panicked Messagethid narrowly escaped a trap. Whoever was behind this wouldn't stop now that their secrets were exposed. If anything, the danger had just escalated. Lisa approached them, her expression unreadable. The phones are already lighting up. People are furious. You've got about 5 minutes before this place is swarmed with reporters and probably worse. You should get out of here. Isaiah and Aaron didn't need to be told twice. They grabbed the folder and headed for the back exit, slipping out into the night just as the first news vans began pulling into the station's parking lot. The air was cold, the streets quiet, but Isaiah knew the calm wouldn't last. Where to now? Aaron asked, his breath visible in the chilly air. Somewhere safe, Isaiah said, his mind racing. We need to lay low until the authorizationist once can step in. My sister's place is out of town. They won't look for us there. Aaron nodded, though his eyes darted nervously to the shadows. You think they'll come after us? I know they will, Isaiah said grimly. But we've got the truth on our side now. They can't bury it anymore. They climbed into Isaiah's car and peeled out of the lot, the city lights fading behind them as they drove into the uncertain night. The powder keg had been ignited, and Winterdale would never be the same, for better or worse. Isaiah and Aaron had set the spark, and now they had to survive the explosion. Would you like me to expand on any part of this story, analyze something specific, or assist with something else? It seems like your message got cut off mid-sentence. I assume you're sharing a story or asking me to analyze or continue it. Since you haven't provided a specific question, I'll treat this as a narrative you'd like me to engage with. If you meant something else like analyzing an ex post, generating an image, or answering a question, please clarify. For now, I'll summarize what you've shared and offer a natural continuation of the story, staying true to its tone and stakes. If this isn't what you intended, let me know how to adjust. Summary of the narrative. Isaiah Carr, a judge, and Aaron Walker, a detective, have uncovered a sprawling corruption scandal involving the Winterdale Police Department and Apex Builders, a local construction company. Their live broadcast exposing bribery, safety violations, and abuse of power has ignited public outrage, protests, and a fierce backlash from those implicated. Threats escalate, anonymous messages, warrants, and fabricated charges aimed at discrediting them. Aaron's on the run, and Isaiah's family is at risk. A hint from Aaron suggests the corruption ties into something even bigger. Cutting off before the revelation. Continuation. There's more going on here than just corruption. Aaron's voice crackled through the phone, low and urgent. Apex Builders have been involved in something bigger, and it's connected to the police department. It's not just about bribes or cover-ups, it's... The line went dead. Isaiah stared at the phone, the silence deafening. His pulse thudded in his temples. Aaron. He redialed, but it went straight to voicemail. Either Aaron's burner phone had died, or someone had gotten to him. Isaiah's stomach twisted. He couldn't lose Aaron now, not when they were this close. He paced the kitchen, Denise watching him with wide, fearful eyes. What did he say? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He didn't finish, Isaiah said, running a hand over his face. But it's bigger than we thought. Apex isn't just greasing palms, they're tangled in something deeper. And if Aaron's right, the police aren't just complicit, they're in on it. Denise stood, her chair scraping against the floor. Isaiah, this is too much. You're talking about taking on people who can frame Aaron, who can threaten us in our own home. What if they come after the kids? I won't let that happen, Isaiah said, his voice firm despite the tremor in his hands. But if we stop now, they win. Everything we've done, everything Aaron's risking, it's for nothing. Denise's lips pressed into a thin line, tears brimming but unshed. I know you're right. I hate this. So do I, Isaiah admitted. He pulled her into a tight embrace, feeling her tremble against him. But we're in it now. We've got to see it through. The next step was clear. Find Aaron and uncover whatever he'd been about to reveal. Isaiah grabbed his coat and keys, pausing only to kiss Denise's forehead. Lock the doors. Call me if anything feels off. I'll be back soon. Outside, the night was cold and still, the streetlights casting long shadows. Isaiah drove toward the outskirts of Winterdale, where Aaron had last been holed up. His mind raced. What could be bigger than corruption, drugs, trafficking, something tied to the steadier hire? Apex Builders had contracts all over the region. Their reach wasn't small. And if the police were more than just bottom, they were active players. This wasn't just a local scandal anymore. His phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. He answered, keeping his voice steady. "Who is this?" "You're digging too deep, Judge," a distorted voice rasped. "Walk away, or we'll bury Yowen not just with paperwork." Isaiah gripped the wheel tighter. "Threats won't stop the truth. It's already out." The voice laughed, cold and hollow. "You think a broadcast changes anything? You've got no idea what's coming." The call ended. Isaiah's jaw clenched. They were scared good. That meant he and Aaron were close. He reached the motel Aaron had mentioned, spotting a flicker of movement in the parking lot. A figure darted between cars, alive but hunted. Isaiah pulled up, and Aaron slipped into the passenger seat, breathless. "They almost had me," Aaron panted, his face gaunt under the dim light. "But I've got it, Isaiah. Apex isn't just a construction front. They're laundering money, millions. And it's not just local cops. It's state officials, maybe federal." Isaiah's blood ran cold. "You're sure?" "Dead sure," Aaron said, pulling a USB drive from his jacket. "I got this from my source. It's everything: names, accounts, dates. If we get this to the right people, it's over for them." "Then we move now," Isaiah said, shifting the car into gear, "before they find us." The road ahead was dark, but the weight of the truth felt lighter. No shared between them. Unstoppable. Whatever came next, they'd face it together. "Let me know if you'd like me to tweak this. Analyze something specific like an ex post or profile related to this. Or pivot to a different task." The air in Isaiah Carr's living room felt thick with an unspoken dread as he clutched the phone, his knuckles whitening from the pressure. A shiver had raced down his spine moments earlier, chilling him to his core as Aaron's voice crackled through the line, revealing a truth so vast and twisted it threatened to unravel everything. Isaiah thought he knew about Winterdale. "There's a network, Isaiah," Aaron had said, his words trembling with urgency. "A tangled web of peopleheaders who've been steering this town from the shadows for years. Apex Builders, that's just the mask they wear. The real power lies with those pulling the strings, and they'll stop at nothing to keep it that way." Isaiah's breath caught in his throat, his mind spinning as the weight of Aaron's revelation sank in. This wasn't just about crooked cops taking bribes or a construction company cutting corner. It was a conspiracy that burrowed deep into the town's foundation, a festering rot that could destroy everything they'd fought to protect. His grip on the phone tightened until his hand ached, a desperate anchor to reality as he forced out a question. "Who's behind it?" His voice was rough, edged with a fear he couldn't hide. Aaron's response came heavy with frustration. "I don't know yet, but I'm going to find out. I just need time." Isaiah's thoughts churned like a storm breaking over the horizon. This was no longer a simple battle for transparency. It was a war against an unseen enemy, one with roots so deep they might never unearth them all. "Be careful, Aaron," he said, his tone thick with worry, a plea wrapped in the words. "We're in too deep to turn back now." Aaron's reply was resolute, though strained. "I know, but we're not giving up." The call ended with a soft click, leaving Isaiah alone with the whirlwind in his mind, each thought crashing into the next like waves against a crumbling shore. He stood motionless in the center of his living room, the soft glow of a nearby lamp painting long, eerie shadows across the walls. The familiar space felt alien now, suffocating under the weight of what he'd just learned. Denise slipped into the room, her footsteps light but deliberate, as if she could sense the tempest brewing within him. Her eyes, soft and searching, met his, and the concern etched into her features deepened as she spoke. "What is it, Isaiah?" Her voice was gentle, a lifeline pulling him back from the edge of his spiraling thoughts. He let out a shaky sigh, dragging a hand across his face as if he could wipe away the exhaustion and dread clinging to him. "It's worse than we thought, Denise," he admitted, his words heavy with the burden of truth. "Aaron's uncovered more. Apex Builders is just a fraud, a distraction. There's an entire network of people running this town, controlling everything from the shadows." Denise's eyes widened, a gasp escaping her lips as her hand flew to her mouth, trembling slightly. The room seemed to shrink around them, the walls pressing in as the enormity of it settled between them. "Isaiah," she whispered, her voice quivering with a mix of fear and disbelief. "What are you going to do?" He met her gaze, his jaw tightening with a resolve that warred against the uncertainty gnawing at his insides. "I don't know yet," he said, each word measured, "but I can't walk away. Not now." She stepped closer, her hands reaching for his, her fingers cool and steady against his clammy palms. "You're not alone in this," she said, her voice firm despite the worry flickering in her eyes. "Just please, be careful." He nodded, his heart a tangled knot of fear and determination, and pulled her into his arms. Her warmth seeped into him, a quiet strength he clung to as they stood there, wrapped in each other. The world outside their embrace growing darker by the second. Justice, he knew, was a distant beacon, but one he couldn't stop chasing, no matter the cost. The next morning found Isaiah hunched over his desk, the cluttered surface of his office strewn with documents that told a damning story of corruption in Winterdale. Papers rustled under his restless fingers, each one a piece of evidence they'd painstakingly gathered enough, he'd once thought, to expose the rot within the police department and Apex builders. But now, with Aaron's discovery of a deeper, more insidious conspiracy, those pages felt like kindling for a fire that could consume them all. The stakes had shifted. The shadowy figures lurking behind Apex wouldn't hesitate to crush anyone who threatened their dominion. His gaze drifted to the window, where the gray light of dawn filtered through, casting a bleak pallor over the room. He needed help, Simeon, with the reach and resolve to take this fight beyond Winterdale's borders. With a steadying breath, he picked up the phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in years. The line rang once, twice, then a familiar voice answered, warm but tinged with surprise. "Isaiah Carr? It's been a long time." Joseph Grayson, an old friend and a seasoned attorney from the state's attorney general's office, had always been a man of principally rare ally in a world too often swayed by power. "Joseph, I need your help," Isaiah said, cutting through the pleasantries, his urgency spilling into every syllable. "I've uncovered something massive: a corruption in the police, bribes, falsified reports, all tied to a local construction company. But it's bigger than that, much bigger. I need someone I can trust to take this to the top." A long silence stretched across the line, the weight of Isaiah's words sinking in. When Joseph spoke again, his tone was low, cautious. "You're serious about this?" It wasn't a question. "Dead serious," Isaiah replied. "All right," Joseph said after a beat. "Send me everything you've got. I'll see what I can do. But Isaiah, be careful. You're stepping into dangerous territory." Isaiah nodded, though Joseph couldn't see it, the warning echoing in his mind. "I know, but this has to be done." Days bled into one another, each one heavier than the last. Outside, Winterdale simmered with unreached protests swelled around the police station and city hall, voices rising in a chorus of anger and desperation. The broadcast Isaiah and Aaron had aired weeks ago had ignited a spark, and now the flames were spreading, uncontainable. But with the growing defiance came escalating threats. Anonymous calls hissed through Isaiah's phone late at night, their cryptic warnings laced with menace. Strange cars lingered outside his home, their tinted windows concealing watchful eyes. The tension coiled tighter with every passing hour, a bomb ticking down to an inevitable explosion. Aaron, now a fugitive with a trumped-up arrest warrant shadowing his every move, had gone underground, leaving Isaiah to shoulder the fight alone. He poured himself into the evidence, working tirelessly with Joseph to build a case that could topple the corrupt empire lurking beneath Winterdale's surface. But the deeper he dug, the more treacherous the path became. One evening, as dusk painted the sky in streaks of bruised purple, Isaiah left the courthouse, his mind buzzing with the day's discoveries. The crunch of gravel under his boots was drowned out by the sudden roar of an engine. A black SUV screeched to a halt beside him, its tinted windows sliding down with a slow, deliberate hum. A man in a crisp suit leaned forward, his face carved from stone, his eyes glinting with a cold, predatory calm. "Judge Carr," he said, his voice smooth as polished steel. "A word of advice. Walk away while you still can. Isaiah's heart slammed against his ribs, but he squared his shoulders, refusing to let fear take root. I'm not walking away, he shot back, his voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through him. The man's lips curled into a smile, sharp and devoid of warmth. That's unfortunate. You're making this personal. Isaiah's fists clenched at his sides, his nails digging into his palms. This is about justice, he said, his words a defiant challenge. And I'm not afraid of you. The man's smile vanished, his gaze hardening into something lethal. You should be. Without another word, the window rolled up, and the SUV peeled away, leaving Isaiah alone on the darkening street, his pulse thundering in his ears. That encounter lit a fire under him. The shadowy forces behind Apex Builders weren't just watching, they were closing in, and he couldn't afford to hesitate. That night, he gathered with Joseph and Lisa Chen, the fearless news producer who'd helped them break the story wide open. They huddled in a cramped conference room, the air thick with the scent of stale coffee and determination. Papers and photographs spilled across the table, a mosaic of corruption they'd pieced together over sleepless nights. Joseph leaned forward, his voice calm but resolute. We've got everything we need. The evidence is ironclad: police reports, financial records, witness statements. We take this to the Attorney General's office tomorrow morning. Once it's out there, there's no turning back. Isaiah nodded, the weight of the decision pressing down on his chest like a stone. Let's do it, he said, his voice firm despite the tremor of doubt beneath it. But just as they began to pack up, Isaiah's phone buzzed sharply against the table. He glanced at the screen, his stomach twisting as Aaron's name flashed across it. The message was brief, urgent. I've got the final piece. Meet me at the old warehouse on 5th Street. The words sent a jolt through him. The warehouse was a decaying relic on the edge of town, its shattered windows and graffiti-streaked walls a testament to years of neglect. It was the kind of place that swallowed secrets, wholly a dangerous rendezvous. Under the best of circumstances, let alone now. He showed the message to Joseph and Lisa, his voice tight. Aaron wants to meet. He says he's got the last piece we need. Joseph's brow furrowed, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. It could be a trap. Isaiah shook his head, a flicker of certainty cutting through his unease. No, it's Aaron. I trust him. Lisa nodded, though her lips pressed into a thin line of worry. Then we go, she said, but we're not taking any chances. They arrived at the warehouse just before midnight, the hulking structure looming against a sky streaked with faint stars. The wind howled through the empty streets, tugging at their coats as they parked a few blocks away and approached on foot. Their footsteps crunched against the cracked pavement, each sound amplified in the oppressive silence. Isaiah's pulse quickened as they stepped inside, the darkness swallowing them like a living thing. The air was damp and heavy, thick with the stench of mold and rust. Broken glass glittered faintly under stray beams of moonlight, and the distant drip of water echoed somewhere in the void. Aaron, Isaiah called, his voice reverberating off the concrete walls, sharp and hollow. For a moment, there was nothing, just the suffocating stillness. Then, from the shadows, a figure emerged. Aaron staggered forward, his face pale and drawn, his eyes wild with a mix of exhaustion and fear. He clutched a worn folder to his chest, his fingers trembling as he scanned the darkness behind him. I've got it, he said, his voice cracking under the strain. The final piece: proof tying Apex Builders to the police department. Names, dates, payments. It's all here. Relief flooded Isaiah, warm and fleeting, as he reached out. Let's see it. But before Aaron could hand it over, a new sound cut through the silence. Low, deliberate footsteps echoing from the far end of the warehouse. Isaiah's heart lurched, his breath catching as he turned toward the entrance. Shadows shifted, and a group of men stepped into view. Dark suits, cold expressions, the same predators who'd cornered him outside the courthouse. The leader's voice slithered through the dark, low and menacing. You should have listened. Judge Carr. Isaiah's blood ran cold, but he stood his ground. The lesson of this moment searing into his soul: power, when abused, bred monsters who'd do anything to protect their empire. Justice wasn't just a cause now, it was a reckoning, one he'd see through no matter the cost. Isaiah's chest heaved with a storm of emotions: fear, defiance, And a flicker of hope he planted himself firmly in front of Baron, his broad shoulders a makeshift shield against the looming threat. The men before them, clad in dark coats that seemed to swallow the dim light of the warehouse, radiated menace. Their leader, a weary figure with sharp cheekbones, curled his lips into a smile, but it was a hollow gesture, devoid of warmth, his eyes glinting like cold steel. "You're too late," Isaiah declared, his voice steady despite the tremor in his gut. "The truth's already out there, spreading like wildfire. You can't stop it now." The man's smirk widened, though it carried no amusement, only a predatory edge. "Oh, we'll see about that," he replied, his tone dripping with quiet menace, as if he relished the challenge. Before Isaiah could brace himself, chaos erupted. One of the Mina hulking brute with a scarred jaw lunged toward Aaron, who stood clutching a weathered folder stuffed with damning evidence. Aaron's eyes widened in panic, his breath catching as he instinctively tightened his grip. He twisted and pulled, his weary frame straining against the attacker's iron hold. But the brute's strength overwhelmed him. With a vicious yank, the folder ripped free from Aaron's hands, the sound of tearing leather slicing through the tense air. Papersments of painstakingly gathered proof fluttered downward like wounded birds, scattering across the grimy concrete floor in a heartbreaking cascade. Isaiah's blood surged hot and furious in his veins, a roar building in his throat as he charged forward, fists clenched, desperate to reclaim what they'd fought so hard for. But another of the men, weary and quick, intercepted him, slamming a meaty palm into Isaiah's chest. The force sent him reeling backward, his body crashing against the warehouse wall with a dull thud that echoed in his skull. Pain radiated through his ribs, but it was the sting of helplessness that cut deeper. "Enough," the leader snarled, his voice a low growl that vibrated with authority. He loomed over them, his shadow stretching long and ominous in the flickering light of a single overhead bulb. "You've stirred up enough trouble, you fools. It ends here." His words hung heavy, a promise of retribution, and for a fleeting moment, Isaiah's resolve wavered. The men turned, their prize in tatters but their mission seemingly complete, ready to vanish into the night. But fate had other plans. Just as they reached the rusted warehouse doors, a sharp wail pierced the stillness sirens, growing louder, closer, a symphony of reckoning. Flashes of red and blue pierced the gloom, bathing the cavernous space in a kaleidoscope of light. The men froze, their confidence fracturing like thin ice under a heavy boot. "Drop it," the command rang out, crisp and unyielding, cutting through the haze of tension. Isaiah's head snapped toward the doorway, where Lisa stood framed against the night, her silhouette unwavering, her dark hair whipped in the chilly breeze, and her eyes blazed with a fierce determination that belied her slight frame. Beside her, a police officer gripped his weapon, his stance rigid with authority. The men hesitated, their gazes darting between one another, weighing their odds. Then, slowly, reluctantly, the scarred brute let the remnants of the folder slip from his grasp. It hit the ground with a soft thud, a defeated surrender. One by one, hands rose into the air, palms open, as the reality of their failure settled in. Isaiah's heart pounded against his ribcage, a wild rhythm of relief and adrenaline. As officers swarmed in, their boots thudding against the concrete, metal clinked as handcuffs snapped shut, and the men were ushered out, their heads bowed under the weight of their downfall. Isaiah stumbled toward Aaron, his breath ragged, his hands trembling as he reached out. Aaron sat slumped on the floor, his pale face streaked with sweat and dust, the aftermath of the struggle etched into every line. "You okay?" Isaiah asked, his voice raw, breathless with concern. Aaron managed a shaky nod, his hazel eyes meeting Isaiah's with a mix of gratitude and exhaustion. "Yeah, thanks," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking louder might shatter the fragile moment. Isaiah's gaze drifted to the scattered papers, their edges curling in the damp air, and a tidal wave of relief crashed over him, washing away the lingering fear. "We did it," he said, the words tasting like victory, hard-won and bittersweet. The fallout was as swift as it was merciless. The evidence they'd unearthed those crumpled pages now gathered, and preserve it proved to be a sledgehammer, smashing through the rotten foundation of Apex Builders. But it didn't stop there. The revelations reached further, toppling high-ranking officials in the Winterdale Police Department and local government, men and women who'd cloaked their greed in badges and titles. The town reeled, its quiet streets buzzing with shock and outrage as the scandal laid bare the festering corruption that had choked it for years. For the first time in a generation, people glimpsed the ugly truth, and with it came a reckoning. Isaiah and Aaron found themselves thrust into the spotlight, hailed as heroes by a grateful populace, yet the title sat uneasily on their shoulders. Heroism felt distant, a word too grand for the exhaustion that weighed them down. They'd done what was right, what was necessary, but the toll was steep sleepless nights, fractured trust, and the constant shadow of danger. Justice had prevailed, yes, but its scars ran deep, a reminder that righteousness often demanded sacrifice. Still, amid the wreckage, a fragile hope took root. The town stirred with whispers of change, a collective yearning to rebuild, to cleanse the system of its rot. The air seemed lighter, as if the exposure of truth had lifted a suffocating veil. Weeks later, Isaiah stood on the weathered steps of the courthouse, the heart of Winterdale sprawling before him. The morning sun peeked over the horizon, painting the cobblestone streets in hues of gold and amber, a quiet promise of renewal. The crisp air bit at his skin, grounding him in the moment, and he inhaled deeply, letting it fill his lungs, his soul. Denise appeared beside him, her presence a steady comfort. Her fingers slipped into his, warm and sure, and he felt the knot in his chest loosen just a fraction. "How do you feel?" she asked, her voice soft but laced with curiosity, her brown eyes searching his face. Isaiah paused, the weight of her question sinking in. His heart swelled with pride, with fatigue, with a flicker of something new. "Like we're just getting started," he replied, his voice steady, resolute. They stood there in silence, the echoes of their struggle lingering in the space between them. The fight had been grueling, a test of everything he held dear: his faith in the law, his belief in justice. He'd always seen the legal system as a beacon, a force for good, but he'd learned its flaws, its fragility, the ease with which power could twist it into a tool of oppression. Yet, standing there, watching the town awaken beneath a new dawn, he understood that justice wasn't just a gift bestowed, it was a battle fought, a garden tended. The corrupt had fallen, their abuse of power laid bare, and in their ruin lay a lesson. No one stood above consequence. That truth, hard-earned and unshakable, was what mattered most. And as the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows behind them, Isaiah felt a quiet peace settle in, a purpose forged in fire, a vow to keep fighting, because justice, in the end, was worth every wound it left behind.